Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Frequency of Sorrow. From Jake Morrison, the CB radio started weeping at 2:47 a.m. on a stretch of Interstate 80 that seemed to swallow headlights whole. I know the exact time because I'd been checking my dashboard clock every few minutes, trying to stay alert through another endless night haul from Sacramento to Chicago. The sound came through Channel 19 like static at first, just a soft crackling that made me reach for the volume knob. But as my calloused fingers turned the dial, the static resolved into something that made my blood run cold in the cab of my Peterbilt. It was crying. Not the electronic whine of interference or the squeal of a bad connection, but the unmistakable sound of human weeping. Soft, rhythmic sobs that rose and fell like a lament, carried on radio waves across the dark highways of America. I'd been driving truck for 23 years. Heard every kind of chatter imaginable on the CB, from lonely drivers singing country songs to dispatchers barking coordinates. But this was something else entirely. The crying had a quality that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to something deeper, some primal part of my brain that recognized grief in its purest form. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, sagebrush and rolling hills disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. The weather was clear but cold, the kind of October night that makes your breath fog even inside the heated cab. My rig hummed steadily beneath me, 18 wheels eating up the miles with mechanical precision, but the sound from the CB made everything feel different. The familiar comfort of the road, the reliable rhythm of diesel and steel, suddenly seemed fragile against whatever was broadcasting that terrible sadness. I keyed the microphone with a trembling thumb. Breaker 19, this is Road Dog Jake. Got someone in distress out there? My voice sounded small in the vast darkness surrounding me. The crying continued without interruption, neither acknowledging my transmission nor changing in intensity. It was steady, consistent, like someone weeping over a loss too profound for consolation. I tried again, using different channels, but the sound seemed to follow me across the frequencies. Channel 7, Channel 13, Channel 21. Everywhere I turned, the dial brought me back to those heartbroken sobs. The miles rolled by and the crying continued, never stopping, never varying in pitch or rhythm. It became the soundtrack to my journey through the night, more constant than the engine noise or the whisper of wind around the cab. I started to make out subtle details in the sound. It was definitely a woman's voice, though distorted by the radio transmission into something ethereal and strange. Sometimes there seemed to be words buried in the sobs, fragments of speech too garbled by emotion and static to understand. The sound had an old quality to it, like recordings from decades past, full of atmospheric hiss and the warm distortion of analog equipment. Near Laramie, I pulled into a truck stop to fuel up and clear my head. The bright fluorescent lights of the plaza felt harsh after hours of darkness, and I squinted as I climbed down from the cab. Other drivers were scattered around the facility, some fueling their rigs, others grabbing coffee and snacks from the travel center. I approached a grizzled driver in a Mack truck, hoping for some explanation or at least confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. "You picking up anything weird on the CB tonight?" I asked him as he squeezed the fuel handle. He looked at me with tired eyes, the kind that have seen too many miles and too many nights. "Just the usual chatter," he said. "Why, you got problems with your radio." I described the crying, the way it seemed to follow me across channels, but his expression remained blank. He finished fueling, shook his head, and walked away without another word. I tried asking 2 other drivers with the same result. Nobody else was hearing what I was hearing, which should have made me feel better, but somehow made everything worse. The crying was meant for me alone, broadcast on some frequency only my radio could receive. Back in the cab, I turned the ignition, and the CB came to life again with those same mournful sobs. They seemed louder now, more immediate, as if the source was getting closer. I pulled back onto the interstate with a growing sense of unease, watching the odometer roll forward and wondering what I was driving toward. The crying had become part of the night itself, woven into the darkness like fog or moonlight, impossible to escape or ignore. Somewhere past Cheyenne, the character of the sound began to change. The sobs grew more urgent, more desperate, punctuated by what sounded like attempts at speech. I leaned closer to the CB speaker, straining to make out words in the static-laden transmission. Gradually, fragments became clear. "Please," came through the crying. "Help me." The words were repeated over and over, sometimes clear, sometimes dissolving back into inconsolable weeping. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I realized this wasn't just random grief broadcasting across the airwaves. Someone was asking for help, reaching out through the CB radio with a desperation that transcended normal communication. But how could I help someone I couldn't locate, couldn't even confirm was real? The voice seemed to exist in the radio waves themselves, unattached to any physical location or identifiable source. "Where are you?" I finally transmitted back. "Give me your location and I'll send help." For a moment, the crying stopped completely. The sudden silence was worse than the weeping, filling the cab with an expectant tension that made my heart race. Then the voice came back, clearer than before, but with an otherworldly quality that made my skin crawl. "Mile marker 378, the voice said through tears. "I've been waiting so long. Please don't leave me here again." I checked my GPS and felt ice form in my stomach. Mile marker 378 was still 50 miles ahead, but I was already committed to this stretch of highway with nowhere else to go. The crying resumed, more intense now, filled with an anticipation that matched my growing dread. Whatever was waiting at mile marker 378 had been expecting me, had been calling to me across the radio waves, drawing me forward through the Wyoming night toward some predetermined encounter. The landscape outside grew more desolate as I approached the marker. Rolling hills gave way to flat prairie, broken only by the occasional ranch road disappearing into darkness. The sky was overcast now, blocking out the stars and creating a void that seemed to press down on the highway. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the blackness, and the CB continued its mournful broadcast, counting down the miles with electronic tears. Mile marker 378 appeared in my headlights like a gravestone, white numerals reflecting the light with stark clarity. As I passed the marker, the crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even the engine noise. I slowed the rig, scanning the roadside for any sign of someone in distress, but saw nothing except empty prairie stretching away into darkness. Then my CB crackled to life with a new sound. Static at first, then a voice clearer than before, but with an impossible quality that made my blood freeze. It was the same woman, but now she sounded close, intimate, as if she was sitting right beside me in the cab. "Thank you for stopping," the voice said. "I've been waiting here since 1987, the night my truck went off the road in the ice storm." I pressed the accelerator, suddenly desperate to get away from mile marker 378, but my speedometer showed the needle dropping despite the engine's increasing RPM. The rig was slowing down against my will, drawn backward by some force I couldn't understand or resist. Through the CB came the sound of wind and breaking glass, the screech of metal and the terrible silence that follows a highway tragedy. "Don't leave me alone again," the voice pleaded. "Stay with me. Keep me company in the dark." The pull on my truck grew stronger, and I fought against it with everything I had. My engine roared in protest, black smoke pouring from the stacks as I demanded maximum power from the diesel. Slowly, incrementally, I began to move forward again, breaking free from whatever force was trying to hold me at the marker. The voice on the CB grew fainter, more distant, fading back into static and tears. I drove through the rest of the night in silence, my CB turned off, afraid to hear what might come through the speakers. As dawn broke over the Nebraska plains, I finally pulled into a truck stop and tried to make sense of what had happened. Research on my phone revealed the truth I'd already suspected. In December 1987, a female truck driver named Maria Santos had crashed at mile marker 378 during an ice storm. Her rig had gone off the road into a ravine, and she hadn't been found for 3 days. The CB radio in her cab had been transmitting on Channel 19 the entire time, broadcasting her calls for help until the battery finally died. Now, as I write this story, I've learned to avoid that stretch of Interstate 80, the mirror that remembers. From Jake Morrison, I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for 17 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these endless highways could throw at me. Deer-jumping guardrails in the pre-dawn darkness, phantom hitchhikers that vanish when you get close enough to see them clearly, and those strange lights that dance just above the tree line on foggy nights. But nothing prepared me for what happened during that run from Chicago to Denver last October. When my passenger side mirror started changing colors, it began as such an ordinary night. I was pulling a full load of electronics in my Peterbilt, the engine humming its familiar deep note that had lulled me through countless miles of solitude. The weather was crisp and clear, with that particular autumn bite that makes you grateful for the warmth radiating from the dashboard vents. My CB crackled occasionally with distant conversations between drivers I'd never meet, their voices threading through the static like ghosts sharing secrets across the dark expanse of Interstate 80. I remember glancing at my mirrors as I always do, checking the lanes behind me with the automatic precision that comes from years of professional driving. The convex surface of the passenger mirror reflected the usual scene: empty asphalt stretching back toward the horizon, streetlights creating pools of amber illumination that grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the night. Everything looked normal, just as it should have at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in western Illinois. But somewhere around the Iowa border, I noticed something different. The mirror's surface seemed to have taken on a subtle blue tint, like looking through colored glass. At first, I assumed it was just reflecting the dashboard lights differently, maybe catching the glow from my GPS screen at an odd angle. These things happen when you're tired, when your eyes start playing tricks on you after too many hours of staring at the white lines rushing beneath your headlights. I rubbed my eyes, adjusted my position in the driver's seat, and told myself it was nothing more than fatigue. The blue deepened as the miles rolled by, becoming more pronounced and undeniable. It wasn't reflecting anything from inside the cab. I checked by covering my instruments with my jacket, but the mirror remained that strange, oceanic blue. The color seemed to pulse gently, like underwater light filtering through deep water, and it made the familiar view behind me look alien and distorted. The road surface appeared darker through that blue lens, and the few cars that passed seemed to move with an almost liquid grace, as if they were swimming rather than driving. I tried adjusting the mirror, thinking maybe moisture had gotten between the glass layers, but the housing felt normal under my touch, neither hot nor cold, just the same textured plastic it had always been. The blue persisted, and worse, it was beginning to show me things that didn't quite match what I could see in my other mirrors. A semi-truck following about a quarter-mile back appeared silver and ordinary in my driver's side mirror. But in the blue-tinted passenger mirror, it looked different, older somehow, with a cab design I didn't recognize and running lights that seemed to burn with an unusual intensity. The CB had gone quiet, which struck me as odd for this stretch of highway. Usually there was at least some chatter between the long-haul drivers, complaints about construction zones or warnings about speed traps ahead. But the radio sat silent except for the occasional burst of static that sounded almost like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't quite understand. I tried calling out, asking if anyone was monitoring Channel 19, but my voice just disappeared into the electronic void without even an echo. As I crossed into Iowa proper, the mirror's color shifted from blue to a deep, unsettling green. The change was gradual, like watching a sunset in reverse, but definitely intentional. This wasn't random light reflection or equipment malfunction. Something was actively altering what I was seeing. The green gave everything behind me a sickly underwater appearance. and I began to notice that the landscape didn't quite match what I remembered from previous runs along this route. The farmland stretching away from the highway looked wrong somehow. The fields were too uniform, the barn roofs too perfectly aligned, as if someone had arranged them for maximum visual impact rather than practical farming purposes. Windbreaks of trees stood in perfectly straight lines that hurt to look at directly, and the few farmhouses I could see were dark in a way that suggested they had been empty for years, rather than simply having their occupants asleep. I pulled into a truck stop near Des Moines, partly for fuel, and partly to see if getting out of the cab would help clear my head. The place was nearly deserted, just a couple of other trucks parked in the far corners of the lot, their drivers presumably catching a few hours of sleep in their sleepers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that makes your teeth ache, and the convenience store clerk looked up from his magazine with eyes that seemed too large for his thin face. Walking around to check the passenger mirror, I expected to find some obvious explanation. A film of road grime creating the color effect, or maybe a manufacturing defect finally manifesting after years of use. But the mirror looked completely normal from the outside, just clear glass reflecting the truck stop's harsh lighting and my own tired face. It was only when I climbed back into the cab and looked through it at the normal angle that the green tint returned, stronger than before. Back on the highway, the mirror continued its color progression. Green faded into a deep amber, like looking through old glass or honey, and the world behind me took on the sepia cast of vintage photographs. The other vehicles on the road began to look increasingly anachronistic through that amber lens. Cars with designs I couldn't quite place, trucks with proportions that seemed slightly off, as if they were based on half-remembered descriptions rather than actual engineering. The amber darkened toward red as I pushed deeper into Iowa, and with the color change came a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with tiredness or caffeine withdrawal. The red tint made everything behind me look like it was bathed in the light of a dying fire, and the few other vehicles I could see seemed to be moving in ways that defied physics. They would appear to be gaining on me rapidly, then suddenly fall back without any visible change in speed, or they would seem to drift from lane to lane without the smooth arcs that normal steering would create. I tried radioing again, desperate for some human contact to ground me in reality, but the CB had developed a new problem. Voices came through clearly now, but they were having conversations that didn't quite make sense. Drivers discussing routes through cities I'd never heard of, comparing notes about truck stops that served food I couldn't identify, warning each other about weather patterns that didn't match anything I could see outside my windshield. The red deepened toward purple as midnight approached, and that's when I started seeing the lights in my passenger mirror that weren't visible anywhere else. They appeared to be following me at a steady distance, maybe half a mile back, but they weren't the normal headlights of cars or trucks. These lights moved in perfect synchronization, rising and falling in gentle waves, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they matched my pace exactly. Through my driver's side mirror and rear view mirror, the highway behind me was completely empty, just dark asphalt disappearing into the night. But the purple-tinted passenger mirror showed those lights getting steadily closer, and now I could make out shapes around them. Not vehicles exactly, but something moving with purpose and intelligence. They seemed to flow rather than roll, undulating across the pavement like oil given form and direction. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig faster than I normally would with a full load, but the lights in the mirror kept pace effortlessly. They were close enough now that I could see they weren't lights at all, but openings, gaps in something dark that revealed burning brightness beyond. They moved in formation, maintaining perfect spacing, and I had the horrible realization that they were somehow aware of me watching them. The purple shifted toward an indigo so deep it was almost black, and the pursuing lights began to change as well, splitting apart and reforming, multiplying and dividing like living cells. What had been 5 or 6 distinct points of light became dozens, then hundreds, spreading across the width of the highway and spilling onto the shoulders and into the fields beyond. They no longer looked like they were following the road at all, but flowing across the landscape like luminous floodwater, converging on my position from every direction. I grabbed my CB handset and called a mayday, not caring if anyone was listening or if they'd think I was having a breakdown. To my surprise, someone answered immediately, a calm female voice that seemed to come from very far away. She told me to keep driving, not to look back through any mirror except the driver's side, and to count the mile markers until I reached mile 247. At that point, she said, I should pull over immediately and wait for exactly 7 minutes before continuing. Mile marker 245 flashed past, and the mirror had gone completely black now, not reflecting anything at all but somehow still showing me the breathing walls. From Marcus Chen, the Peterbilt 379 had been my home for 3 years, when I first noticed something wasn't quite right with the sleeper berth. Though looking back now, I wonder if the signs were always there, hidden beneath the familiar rhythms of highway life and diesel dreams. I'd bought the rig used from a lot in Bakersfield, California, where the salesman had been unusually eager to close the deal, his smile a little too wide when he handed me the keys and mentioned something about the previous owner having moved on to better things. The truck ran beautifully, her chrome gleaming and her engine purring like a satisfied cat. But it was the custom sleeper that had really sold me on her, a spacious compartment that the previous owner had outfitted with cedar paneling and extra insulation that made it feel like a cozy cabin rather than just another trucker's bunk. Those first months on the road were some of the best of my driving career, hauling freight from the Pacific Northwest down through the heartland and back again, watching the seasons change through my windshield while the miles clicked by beneath my wheels. The sleeper was everything I'd hoped for, quiet and comfortable even when parked at the noisiest truck stops, the cedar walls seeming to breathe with their own gentle warmth that made even the coldest nights feel welcoming. I'd lie there in the darkness listening to the distant hum of other engines and the occasional crackle of CB chatter, feeling more at home than I had in years. It was somewhere outside of Omaha, Nebraska, on a particularly still October night, that I first noticed the subtle movement in the walls. I pulled into a rest area just off Interstate 80, one of those quiet spots where the highway noise fades to a whisper, and the only light comes from a few scattered lampposts casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. I'd been driving for 9 hours straight, my eyes heavy with the kind of fatigue that comes from watching endless stretches of cornfields roll by under an overcast sky, and I was looking forward to nothing more than crawling into my bunk and letting sleep take me away from the ache in my shoulders and the persistent throb behind my temples. The temperature had dropped with the setting sun, and I could feel the autumn chill seeping through the cab as I went through my usual routine, checking the load securement one last time and making sure everything was locked down for the night. Back in the sleeper, I settled onto the narrow mattress and pulled the heavy blanket up to my chin, grateful for the warmth that seemed to radiate from the cedar walls themselves. That's when I first saw it, a barely perceptible movement in the wood grain, as if the panels were shifting ever so slightly in rhythm with something I couldn't quite identify. At first, I thought it might be my tired eyes playing tricks on me, or perhaps the natural expansion and contraction of the wood responding to the temperature change. The movement was so subtle that I had to stare directly at one section of wall to even notice it, a gentle swelling and receding that seemed to follow a slow, steady pattern. I watched for several minutes, my fatigue temporarily forgotten as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. But eventually exhaustion won out and I drifted off to sleep, telling myself it was nothing more than an optical illusion brought on by too many hours on the road. The next morning brought sunshine and the familiar bustle of highway traffic, and in the bright light of day, the walls looked perfectly normal, their cedar grain smooth and static as walls should be. I convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, a product of overtiredness and the strange tricks that darkness can play on a weary mind. I grabbed a quick breakfast at the next truck stop, topped off my fuel tanks, and got back to the business of moving freight across the country. The strange incident from the night before fading into the background noise of road life. But the movement returned the following night, and the night after that, always subtle, always just at the edge of perception, like something breathing very slowly and very quietly behind the wood. I began to pay closer attention, lying awake in my bunk and studying the walls with the careful focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The pattern was consistent, a gentle expansion followed by a slow contraction, repeating every 15 seconds or so with mechanical precision. I pressed my hand against the cedar panels and could swear I felt a slight give, as if there were empty space behind them where the truck's original metal wall should have been. The discovery came 3 weeks later, during a mandatory rest period at a way station in Wyoming, where the wind howled across the empty plains with a loneliness that seemed to seep into my bones. I'd been lying awake for hours, watching the walls breathe their slow rhythm, when I noticed that one of the cedar panels sat slightly proud of the others, creating a small gap that hadn't been there when I'd first inspected the sleeper months earlier. Curiosity finally overcame caution, and I worked my fingers into the gap, surprised to find that the panel came away easily, revealing not the truck's original wall, but a dark space that seemed to extend further back than the sleeper's dimensions should have allowed. The smell that wafted from the opening was unlike anything I'd encountered before, organic and warm, like the inside of a greenhouse or the breath of some large sleeping animal. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam revealing what appeared to be a cavity lined with something that definitely wasn't metal or insulation. The surface was smooth and slightly translucent, with a pinkish hue that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. As I watched, the entire space contracted slowly, then expanded again, and I realized with a sick certainty that I was looking at something alive. My hands shook as I replaced the panel, but even with the cedar back in place, I could no longer ignore what I now understood to be the breathing of something vast and patient that had somehow grown within the walls of my sleeper. Sleep became impossible as I lay there, feeling the gentle rhythm all around me, the walls expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization, as if the entire compartment were nestled inside some enormous lung. Every surface seemed to pulse with that slow, steady breathing, and I began to understand that what I'd taken for superior insulation was actually something far more unsettling. The next morning, I drove straight to a truck stop with a full-service garage, determined to have the sleeper torn apart and rebuilt with conventional materials. But when I explained what I wanted done, the mechanics looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. One of them, an older man with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, took a long look at my rig and shook his head slowly. He told me he'd seen that truck before, back when Jim Hartley owned it, and that Jim had disappeared one night somewhere in Colorado, leaving nothing behind but the Peterbilt parked at a rest stop with the sleeper door standing open and his logbook still warm on the driver's seat. I left the truck stop without having any work done, the mechanic's words echoing in my mind as I merged back onto the interstate and tried to focus on the familiar routine of driving. But concentration became increasingly difficult as the days passed, because now I could feel the breathing even while I was behind the wheel, a slow, patient rhythm that seemed to be getting stronger. The walls of the sleeper weren't the only things that moved anymore. I began to notice subtle shifts in the cab itself, the headliner sagging slightly with each breath, the door panels flexing in that same measured cadence. Worse still, I found that my own breathing was beginning to synchronize with whatever lived within my truck, my lungs filling and emptying in time with the wall's expansion and contraction. Sleep, when it came at all, brought dreams of being swallowed whole, of sliding down some enormous throat into a warm, dark place where the breathing surrounded me completely, and my own identity began to dissolve into something larger and hungrier than myself. The final night came in a truck stop outside of Denver, where I'd pulled in with the desperate hope that being surrounded by other drivers and the noise of civilization might somehow break the connection I felt growing stronger with each passing hour. But even there, parked between two other rigs with their generators humming and their lights glowing, I could feel the creature's breath moving through every surface of my sleeper, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was ready to complete whatever process had begun the moment I'd first noticed those gently moving walls. I write this now from a different truck, a bare-bones highway tractor with no sleeper at all, though I know the creature is still out there somewhere, patient and breathing, waiting in that beautiful cedar-lined compartment for the next driver who thinks they've found the perfect home on the road. Sometimes, late at night when I'm forced to sleep in a motel, I still find my breathing falling into that familiar rhythm, and I wonder if distance means anything at all to something that's learned to live in the spaces between spaces, growing quietly in the dark until it's ready to make everything else part of its slow, eternal breath. The Quiet Mile, from Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been silent for 3 hours when she climbed into my cab outside Bakersfield, and I should have known right then that something was off about the whole situation. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar lullaby as we rolled through the California desert, the headlights carving twin tunnels through the darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond their reach. She'd appeared at the truck stop like a ghost materializing from the heat shimmer that still rose from the asphalt despite the late hour, wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying nothing but a small leather purse that she clutched against her chest, like it contained her entire world. "Just need to get to Phoenix," she'd said when I rolled down the passenger window, her voice soft and measured in a way that reminded me of my daughter's kindergarten teacher. "I can pay for gas." There was something in her eyes that made me say yes, something desperate but trying very hard not to show it. Maybe it was the way she kept glancing over her shoulder at the empty lot behind her, or how her hands trembled just slightly as she counted out 20s from that leather purse. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, and you develop an instinct about people who need help versus people who might cause trouble. Sarah, she said her name was, fell somewhere in between those categories in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. The first 100 miles passed in comfortable silence, the kind that settles between strangers who've made an unspoken agreement to respect each other's space. Sarah sat with her back straight against the passenger seat, that purse still pressed tight against her stomach, watching the desert roll by through the windshield with an intensity that seemed almost meditative. Occasionally she'd nod at something only she could see, her lips moving in what might have been silent conversation or prayer. The radio picked up only static between stations, that white noise mixing with the engine's steady rumble and the whisper of wind around the cab to create a cocoon of sound that made the outside world feel impossibly distant. It was somewhere near the Nevada border when she started talking, her words coming out in a steady stream that seemed to pour from some deep well of need inside her chest. She told me about her sister in Phoenix, about the phone call that had come at 3 in the morning, about packing everything she owned into 2 suitcases and leaving her apartment key on the kitchen counter. Her voice never wavered, never showed any emotion beyond a kind of mechanical precision. But there was something underneath it that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. She spoke about driving her car until it broke down just outside Bakersfield, about walking 6 miles to the truck stop in shoes that weren't made for walking, about calling everyone she knew until she realized there was no one left to call. "People disappear," she said suddenly, turning to look at me with eyes that reflected the dashboard lights like coins at the bottom of a well. "Not all at once, not dramatically. They just fade away until one day you look around and realize you're standing in an empty room talking to yourself." She laughed then, a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. "Do you know what that feels like, Jake? To realize you've been alone for so long you've forgotten what your own voice sounds like when someone else is listening?" The way she said my name made something cold settle in my stomach because I was certain I hadn't told her what to call me. My name wasn't painted on the truck, wasn't on any patch or badge she could have seen. But before I could ask, she was talking again, her words flowing like water finding its way downhill, following the path of least resistance through topics that seemed connected only in her mind. She told me about her job at the insurance office, about processing claims for people who'd lost everything, about the strange comfort she'd found in other people's disasters. She described her apartment in detail, the way the morning light fell across the kitchen table, the sound the refrigerator made when it cycled on, the neighbor's cat that would sit on her fire escape and watch her through the window. But something was wrong with her stories, some subtle inconsistency that nagged at the edges of my attention, like a splinter I couldn't locate. She mentioned her sister's children, then later referred to her sister as childless. She described her car as a blue Honda, then a red Toyota, then seemed confused when I asked her to clarify. Small details shifted and changed in her narrative like water flowing around stones, and each contradiction made that cold feeling in my stomach spread a little further through my chest. "Time gets funny when you're alone too much," she said when she noticed me glancing at her with increasing concern. "Days blend together, memories get mixed up. Sometimes I'll remember something that happened last week and realize it was actually last year. Or maybe it never happened at all. Maybe I just wanted it to happen so badly that I convinced myself it was real." She opened her purse and pulled out a photograph, holding it up so I could see it in the dashboard lights. It showed a woman who might have been Sarah, standing next to someone who'd been carefully cut out of the image, leaving only an arm draped around her shoulders and a shadow where another person should have been. The truck's engine seemed to grow louder as we climbed into the mountains, that familiar rumble taking on undertones I'd never noticed before, harmonics that sounded almost like voices if I listened too carefully. Sarah's monologue continued without interruption, flowing from topic to topic with a logic that existed only in her mind. She talked about her childhood, about parents who'd worked too much and loved too little, about teachers who'd forgotten her name before the semester ended, about friends who'd drifted away like smoke on a wind she couldn't feel. Every story ended the same way, with Sarah standing alone in an empty space where other people used to be. "The insurance office was perfect for someone like me," she continued, her fingers working at the clasp of her purse with nervous energy. "All day long I'd read about other people's lives, their losses, their desperate attempts to recover what they'd lost. House fires, car accidents, theft, flood damage. Every claim was a story about someone's world falling apart, and I was the person who decided whether their story was worth believing." She laughed again, that broken glass sound that made me want to turn up the radio to drown it out. Funny thing is, I was good at it. Really good. I could spot inconsistencies, fabrications, the little lies people tell themselves when they're trying to make their losses seem bigger than they really were. The headlights swept across a road sign indicating 50 miles to Phoenix, but instead of relief I felt a growing sense of urgency, like something was building toward a conclusion I didn't want to reach. Sarah had opened her purse completely now, and I could see it was filled with photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same thing. Sarah standing alone or with pieces of other people carefully removed, leaving only shadows and disconnected limbs arranged around her like the remnants of relationships that had never quite solidified into reality. "I started keeping files on everyone I met," she said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that made my hands sweat against the steering wheel. "Not official files, personal ones. I'd write down everything they told me, every detail of their lives, so I could remember them perfectly when they inevitably disappeared. Because they always disappeared, Jake, always. No matter how hard I tried to hold on to them. They'd fade away until I couldn't remember their faces or their voices or the way they made me feel when I wasn't alone." She pulled out more photographs, and I could see now that some of them showed empty spaces where she should have been too, as if she was slowly erasing herself from her own memories. The engine's rumble was definitely voices now, a chorus of whispers that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, and I realized with growing horror that they were saying names. Dozens of names, maybe hundreds, repeated over and over in tones of loss and longing that made my chest feel tight with sympathetic grief. Sarah was nodding along with the whispers, her lips moving in silent acknowledgement of each name as it echoed through the cab. "That's why I need to get to Phoenix," she said, turning to face me with eyes that no longer reflected the dashboard lights but seemed to generate their own pale glow. "My sister called, you see. She needs me to come identify someone they found. Someone who'd been missing for a very long time. Someone who'd disappeared so completely that even the people who should have remembered her had forgotten she ever existed. She reached over and touched my arm with fingers that felt like ice through my shirt. The strange thing is, Jake, I don't remember having a sister. But when she called, when she said my name, it felt so real, so true, that I knew it had to be important. The truck was slowing down even though I hadn't touched the brakes. The engine's voices growing louder and more insistent, and I could see Phoenix's light spreading across the desert ahead like a galaxy fallen to Earth. Sarah was gathering her photographs, tucking them back into her purse with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual. The chiming road. From Marcus Chen. The thing about driving highways at 3 in the morning is that you start to notice patterns that daylight drivers never see. I've been hauling freight cross-country for 15 years now, and I can tell you that the interstate has its own rhythm after midnight, its own quiet pulse that beats beneath the hum of diesel engines and the whisper of tires on asphalt. My Kenworth T680 knows these roads as well as I do. Every grade and curve memorized in the steady thrum of her engine. But that Tuesday night in October, something felt different from the moment I pulled out of the truck stop in Barstow. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Interstate 40, a vast expanse of moonlit sand and scattered Joshua trees that seemed to watch my passing with ancient patience. I'd driven this route countless times before, carrying everything from electronics to auto parts between Los Angeles and Albuquerque. But tonight the familiar landscape felt somehow expectant, as if it were holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. The radio crackled with distant CB chatter, truckers calling out smoky reports and weather updates in the coded language we all understood, but even their voices seemed muted, swallowed by the immensity of the desert night. Mile marker 47 appeared in my headlights, a standard green reflective sign that I'd passed hundreds of times without a second thought. But as my truck drew alongside it, a sound drifted through my slightly open driver's side window that made me ease off the accelerator and cock my head to listen more carefully. It was a chime, soft and melodious like the sound of wind bells dancing in a gentle breeze. The tone was sweet and somehow nostalgic, reminding me of the brass chimes my grandmother used to hang on her front porch back in Oregon. But there was no wind tonight, no breeze to stir anything into song. I glanced in my mirrors as the mile marker disappeared behind me, telling myself that desert acoustics could play strange tricks on a tired mind, that the sound had probably been nothing more than a loose piece of metal somewhere in my trailer, vibrating in harmony with the road. The load I was carrying was furniture bound for a store in Flagstaff, carefully secured but perhaps not immune to the subtle resonances that long-haul trucking could create. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and tried to focus on the yellow center line that stretched ahead like a painted river. But the memory of that chiming sound lingered in my mind like the echo of a half-remembered melody. Mile marker 48 came and went without incident. Then 49, and I began to relax into the familiar meditation of night driving. The dashboard lights cast a soft green glow across my hands and reflected dimly in the windshield, creating a cocoon of mechanical comfort that separated me from the vast darkness outside. Coffee from the last truck stop had grown cold in its thermos, but I sipped it anyway, savoring the bitter familiarity as I settled into the rhythm that would carry me through the long hours until dawn. The CB radio murmured occasionally with distant voices, ghost conversations from truckers miles away, and I found comfort in knowing that I wasn't entirely alone on this ribbon of asphalt that connected nowhere to somewhere else. But when mile marker 50 appeared in my headlights, the chiming sound returned, clearer this time and unmistakably real. It wasn't coming from my truck or my load, I was certain of that now, because the sound seemed to emanate from the mile marker itself, a crystalline cascade of notes that hung in the air like visible music. I slowed the truck to a crawl and lowered my window completely, letting the desert air flow into the cab as I listened with growing unease to a melody that had no earthly source. The chimes rang with perfect clarity, each note distinct and pure, creating harmonies that seemed to tell a story without words, a narrative of longing and loss that reached directly into some primitive part of my brain and whispered that I should pay attention. Mile marker 51 chimed as well, and 52, each one adding new voices to a chorus that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing sign. I found myself driving slower and slower, reluctant to leave each singing post behind, drawn by curiosities that overrode my professional instincts to maintain schedule and keep moving toward my destination. The melodies were different at each marker, unique compositions that nevertheless harmonized with what had come before, as if the entire highway were becoming a vast musical instrument played by invisible hands for an audience of one tired trucker who happened to be passing through at exactly the right moment. By mile marker 55, I was barely crawling along at 15 miles per hour, my hazard lights blinking orange warnings to any traffic that might come up behind me, though the road remained empty in both directions as far as I could see. The chiming had evolved into something beyond simple wind chimes now, a complex symphony of metallic voices that seemed to sing of journeys taken and journeys yet to come, of travelers who had passed this way before, and left echoes of their passage hanging in the desert air like musical ghosts. I pulled onto the shoulder near mile marker 56 and shut off the engine, needing to hear the sounds clearly without the interference of diesel rumble and road noise. In the sudden silence that followed, the chiming intensified, as if responding to my attention with gratitude and increased effort. Each mile marker I could see in either direction was singing now, their melodies interweaving like a conversation between old friends, and I realized with growing amazement that I was witnessing something that few people would ever experience, a secret concert performed by the highway itself for anyone wise enough to stop and listen. The desert wind was barely a whisper, insufficient to move even the lightest chime, yet the music continued with breathtaking beauty, notes that seemed to hang in the air like stars and fade only when new ones took their place. I climbed down from the cab and walked a few steps away from my truck, wanting to hear the phenomenon more clearly, and that's when I noticed that the mile markers weren't just singing, they were glowing. Each post emanated a soft phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with its melody, green numbers and letters that seemed to breathe with their own inner luminescence. The effect was hypnotically beautiful, transforming the ordinary highway markers into beacons of supernatural music that turned the desert night into something from a dream or fairy tale. And I found myself walking slowly toward the nearest marker, drawn by curiosity and wonder that overwhelmed any sense of caution. Mile marker 56 stood before me like a glowing sentinel, its chiming clearer now than church bells on a Sunday morning. And as I approached to within arm's length, I could see that the sound was indeed coming from the sign itself, though there was nothing attached to it that could possibly create music. The metal surface vibrated subtly, as if the entire structure had become a tuning fork struck by cosmic forces, and when I tentatively reached out to touch it, the chiming shifted to a minor key that spoke of sadness and warning, a musical caution that made my hand pause inches from the glowing surface. That's when I heard the other sound, beneath the chiming and almost lost in the desert silence, the distant rumble of heavy engines approaching from the west. I turned to look back down the highway and saw lights in the distance, a convoy of trucks moving fast in my direction, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. But there was something wrong with the way they moved, too smooth and silent for their apparent speed. And as they drew closer, I realized that while I could see their lights and hear the ghost of their engines, they cast no illumination on the road surface, threw no shadows, left no trace of their passage except for the gradually intensifying sound of diesel engines that had no source. The lead truck passed through my position without slowing, its headlights washing over me with cold light that I could see but not feel. And I caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the cab, pale and drawn and staring straight ahead with eyes that held no recognition of my presence. More trucks followed, an entire convoy of ghost rigs hauling phantom loads down a highway that existed in some other dimension of time and space. their passage marked only by the increasing urgency of the mile markers chiming, as if the signs were trying to warn me of something that my conscious mind couldn't quite grasp. I ran back to my truck and climbed into the cab, my hands shaking as I turned the key and felt the reliable rumble of my own very real engine come to life. The ghost convoy was disappearing into the eastern distance, but mile marker 57 was already glowing brighter than the others, its chiming song filled with an urgency that spoke of immediate danger, and I realized that whatever phenomenon I had stumbled upon was reaching some kind of crescendo that I didn't want to be present for. I dropped the transmission into gear and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating steadily as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever supernatural crossroads I had inadvertently discovered. But mile marker 57 chimed with warning tones that made my skin crawl and my foot press harder on the accelerator. The reflection road, from Marcus Reed, the windshield of my Peterbilt 379 had always been my window to the world. But on that foggy November night somewhere between Bakersfield and Sacramento, it became something else entirely. Something impossible. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours, creating that hypnotic rhythm against the glass that usually helped me stay focused on the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead. But tonight the droplets seemed to move differently, forming patterns that lingered too long before sliding away into the darkness. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods for 15 years, and Highway 99 was as familiar to me as my own driveway. Every truck stop, every overpass, every mile marker was burned into my memory like waypoints on a well-traveled map. The CB radio crackled occasionally with conversations between other drivers, their voices a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone out here in the California night. My headlights carved through the mist, illuminating the yellow lines that guided me northward, while the steady hum of the diesel engine created its own lullaby beneath the storm. That's when I first noticed it, a strange doubling in my peripheral vision, as if the world beyond my windshield had suddenly developed a stutter. At first, I attributed it to fatigue. My logbook showed I'd been driving for 9 hours, and even with the mandatory brakes, the road could play tricks on a tired mind. But as I adjusted my position in the driver's seat and rubbed my eyes, the phenomenon persisted. The landscape ahead seemed to shimmer and split, like looking at a reflection in disturbed water. The exit signs began to show destinations I didn't recognize. Millerville, population 12,000. Thorndale, 15 miles. Cedar Junction, next 3 exits. These weren't towns on Highway 99, weren't places I'd ever heard of in all my years crossing this valley. My GPS device showed a blank screen, its satellite signal apparently lost in the storm, while my cell phone displayed no service bars despite being in an area where I'd never had coverage problems before. The CB radio had gone silent too, no longer carrying the familiar chatter of late-night truckers pushing through the weather. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to reach familiar territory, but the strange signs continued. Bakersfield hadn't been this far behind me, and Sacramento should have been appearing on the horizon by now. Instead, the highway stretched endlessly through a landscape that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. The hills rolled in patterns I almost recognized, but their contours were wrong somehow, as if someone had taken a photograph of the Central Valley and stretched it in impossible directions. The windshield itself had become the strangest part of this experience. Where normally I would see straight through the glass to the road ahead, now there appeared to be 2 overlapping images. The highway I knew, and another road that existed in the same space but led somewhere else entirely. Through the familiar view, I could see the storm-soaked asphalt and the reflective road markers I'd been following for hours. But through the other image, barely visible like a double exposure, stretched a different highway altogether. This second road appeared darker, lit not by electric streetlights but by an older form of illumination that flickered like flame. The buildings I glimpsed through this alternate view were wrong in ways I struggled to articulate. Gas stations with architecture from decades past, their signs advertising brands that seemed familiar yet different. Phillips 76 instead of Phillips 66. Chevron shields that faced the wrong direction. A truck stop that looked exactly like the Flying J I'd passed 2 hours ago, except its parking lot was filled with vehicles I didn't recognize. Trucks with unfamiliar logos and passenger cars with designs that seemed both retro and futuristic. My hands gripped the steering wheel, tighter as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The two realities flickered back and forth through my windshield like competing television channels, sometimes showing me the empty highway I expected, other times revealing this parallel version of my route. In the reflection from my side mirrors, I caught glimpses of my own truck, but even it appeared different in this alternate view. The same red Peterbilt, but with subtle variations in the trim and license plates that displayed completely different numbers. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but I decided to stop at the next truck stop to gather my thoughts and maybe catch a few hours of sleep in the sleeper cab. When the familiar blue and red sign of a travel center appeared through both versions of my windshield reality, I carefully guided the truck off the highway. The parking lot looked normal enough as I pulled into a space between two other big rigs, their drivers presumably asleep in their cabs while the rain continued its steady percussion against metal and glass. Inside the travel center, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while a lone clerk worked behind the counter, sorting through receipts and occasionally glancing up at the security monitors. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the self-service station and walked around the convenience store, trying to settle my nerves and convince myself that fatigue and weather had simply created an optical illusion. The coffee was hot and bitter, grounding me in familiar sensations while I studied a road atlas to confirm my location. But when I looked up from the map, the clerk was gone. The lights continued humming. The security monitors still glowed with their views of empty aisles and the rain-soaked parking lot, but no one stood behind the counter. The receipt he'd been sorting lay scattered across the floor, and the register drawer hung open as if he'd simply vanished mid-transaction. I called out, thinking perhaps he'd stepped into a back room, but my voice echoed through empty space without response. Through the travel center's windows, the parking lot looked different now. My truck sat where I'd left it, but the other vehicles had changed. The two big rigs that had flanked my Peterbilt were gone, replaced by trucks I didn't recognize. Older models with configurations that seemed both familiar and impossible. Their chrome gleamed despite the rain, and their running lights created patterns of color that didn't match any manufacturer standards I knew. I left money for the coffee on the counter and hurried back to my truck, eager to get back on the highway and push through to Sacramento, where I could rest in a more familiar environment. But as I climbed into the cab and fired up the diesel engine, my windshield revealed both realities more clearly than before. The travel center I'd just left appeared normal through one view, a typical truck stop with standard lighting and recognizable architecture. Through the alternate view, however, the same building looked older and somehow more weathered. Its signs advertising services and products I couldn't quite identify. Back on the highway, the two-world phenomenon intensified. Mile markers showed different numbers depending on which reality I focused on, and the digital clock on my dashboard seemed to display different times when viewed through each version of the windshield. In one reality, it was 2:30 a.m. In the other, the clock showed 11:47 p.m., as if I'd somehow traveled backward through the night. The fuel gauge, too, showed different readings. 3/4 in one view, nearly empty in the other. Other vehicles began appearing on the alternate highway, their headlights visible through the second reality like distant stars. I watched an 18-wheeler pass me in the other world, its trailer displaying a logo I'd never seen despite knowing every major shipping company on the West Coast. A sequence of passenger cars followed, their designs mixing elements from different decades in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Taillights from the 1970s combined with body shapes from the 1990s, creating vehicles that existed only in this strange parallel version of my familiar route. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a transmission that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "Eastbound Peterbilt, you copy?" The voice sounded familiar but distorted. as if transmitted across a great distance or through some kind of interference. I picked up the handset and responded, identifying myself and my location, but the return transmission was garbled and filled with static that formed almost musical patterns. "Marcus Reed." "This is Marcus Reed," came the reply, spoken in a voice that was unmistakably my own. "You need to choose which road you're traveling before you can't find your way back." The transmission ended with a burst of static that faded into a low humming sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard on the CB frequencies. I tried to respond, but my radio had gone silent again, its display showing channels that didn't match the settings I'd programmed. Ahead, the highway began to diverge in ways that defied the physical reality I knew. While the familiar route continued straight through the valley, the alternate road curved away to the east, its path illuminated by those flickering flame-like lights I'd noticed earlier. Through my windshield, I could see both paths simultaneously, one leading to Sacramento and the end of my delivery route, the other stretching toward destinations I couldn't identify but somehow felt compelled to explore. The steering wheel began to vibrate in my hands, not with the familiar rumble of road imperfections or mechanical issues, but with a strange resonance that seemed to come from the windshield itself, the sleeper full of broken glass. From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you think you've seen everything the road can throw at you. Ice storms in Montana that turn your windshield into a spider web of cracks. Fog so thick in Oregon that you're crawling at 15 miles per hour with your hazards blinking like a dying heartbeat. Desert heat in Arizona that makes the asphalt shimmer like water, creating mirages of lakes that vanish the moment you think you might reach them. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for what I found in that abandoned Peterbilt on Interstate 40, just outside of Amarillo, Texas. It was one of those September nights when the air still holds the last breath of summer heat, but there's something underneath it, something cooler and sharper that promises autumn is coming whether you're ready or not. The moon was thin as a fingernail clipping, barely casting enough light to illuminate the mesquite bushes that dotted the roadside like sleeping cattle. My CB radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up fragments of conversations from truckers hundreds of miles away, their voices fading in and out like ghosts trying to tell stories from beyond. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Atlanta, and my eyelids were starting to feel heavy as lead weights. The coffee I'd picked up at the last truck stop had gone cold hours ago, leaving nothing but bitter dregs in the bottom of my thermos. The gentle hum of my Freightliner's engine had taken on that hypnotic quality that can lull you into microsleeps if you're not careful. Those dangerous little moments where your brain shuts down for a second or two, while your hands keep the wheel steady out of pure muscle memory. That's when I saw the truck on the shoulder, maybe half a mile ahead. Even in the dim glow of my headlights, I could tell it was a Peterbilt, probably from the early 90s, with that classic long nose and the kind of chrome work that truckers used to take real pride in. But something about it seemed wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Maybe it was the way it sat at a slight angle, as if it had been parked in a hurry, or maybe it was how completely dark it was. No running lights, no interior glow, nothing to suggest there was anyone inside. Professional courtesy is a big thing in trucking. We look out for each other out here because nobody else will. If you see a fellow driver broken down, you stop and check if they need help. Offer to call for a tow, maybe share some coffee or a sandwich if they're going to be waiting a while. It's an unwritten rule that's kept more drivers safe than all the DOT regulations combined. So when I saw that Peterbilt sitting there like a beached whale in the darkness, I knew I had to pull over. I eased my rig onto the shoulder about 50 yards behind the other truck, leaving plenty of room in case traffic needed to merge. The moment I stepped out of my cab, the silence hit me like a physical thing. No engine noise, no air brakes hissing, no sound of generators running to keep sleeper compartments cool. Just the whisper of wind through the dry grass and the distant hum of late-night traffic on the interstate. The air smelled of dust and diesel fumes and something else something sharp and clean that reminded me of winter mornings. As I walked toward the Peterbilt, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder, I called out the way drivers do when approaching another truck at night. Nothing too loud, nothing that might startle someone who could be sleeping. Just a friendly, "Hey there, you need any help?" But there was no response, no movement from the cab. No sign that anyone had heard me at all. The truck was beautiful, I'll give it that. Someone had spent serious money on the chrome work, and even in the poor light I could see that the paint job was immaculate. A deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb what little moonlight there was. The stacks were polished aluminum, and the cab had enough lights to make a Christmas tree jealous, though none of them were on. But as I got closer, I started to notice the details that made my skin crawl. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough to let the interior dome light create a pale rectangle in the darkness. Except there was no light. The door was open, but the cab was as black as a cave. The windshield caught a reflection from my flashlight as I approached, and for a moment I thought I saw movement inside, a shadow shifting behind the glass, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I reached the driver's door and pulled it open wider, the hinges creaking like old bones. The smell hit me immediately, that sharp, clean scent I'd noticed earlier, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. It took me a moment to place it, and when I did, my blood went cold. It was the smell of fresh broken glass, that distinctive ozone-like odor that fills the air when a window shatters. The cab was empty, but everything looked normal. The keys were still in the ignition, dangling from a keychain shaped like a miniature truck. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone much shorter than me, and there was a half-empty bottle of Dr. Pepper in the cup holder, still cold to the touch. The logbook on the passenger seat showed entries from earlier that day, written in careful handwriting that belonged to someone named Elena Vasquez, running a load of furniture from Phoenix to Dallas. But it was the sleeper that made my hands start shaking. I climbed up into the cab and pulled back the curtain that separated the driving compartment from the sleeping area, and what I saw didn't make sense at first. The sleeper berth was filled, completely filled with broken glass. Not just a little bit, not like someone had accidentally broken a mirror or a drinking glass. The entire sleeping area, from floor to ceiling, was packed solid with glittering fragments of shattered glass, as if someone had taken hundreds of windows and bottles and mirrors and smashed them all into pieces, then carefully arranged every single shard in that small space. The glass caught the beam of my flashlight and threw it back in 1,000 different directions, creating a kaleidoscope of light that hurt to look at. But there was something else, something that made me lean closer despite every instinct telling me to back away. Mixed in with all that broken glass, I could see personal items. A woman's wristwatch, its band cut cleanly in two. A cell phone with a spiderweb crack across its screen. A trucker's cap with "World's Greatest Grandpa" embroidered on it. The bill sliced into ribbons, and then I saw the photographs. They were scattered throughout the glass like leaves in a snowdrift. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Family photos, vacation snapshots, pictures of trucks and pets and children. All of them cut and torn as if someone had taken scissors to them with methodical precision. I could make out faces in the fragments, pieces of smiles and eyes and embracing figures, all separated and mixed together in a collage of destroyed memories. The smell of broken glass was getting stronger, so strong it was making my eyes water. I tried to back out of the cab, but something stopped me. There was movement in the glass, a shifting and settling like the contents of an hourglass, and I realized with growing horror that the pile was getting deeper, the fragments multiplying even as I watched. A sound came from somewhere inside that mass of shattered glass, a soft tinkling like wind chimes, but underneath it was something else, something that might have been breathing, or might have been the whisper of glass edges grinding against each other. I wanted to run, every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out of that truck and never look back, but I couldn't move. The light from my flashlight seemed to be getting absorbed by the glass, the beam growing dimmer and dimmer until I could barely see. That's when I heard the voice. It was soft, barely audible over the sound of settling glass, but distinctly female. It was calling for help, the voice weak and desperate coming from somewhere deep inside that pile of fragments. I leaned forward despite myself, straining to hear the words, and realized it was saying a name over and over again. "Marcus," it whispered. "Marcus, help me." The shock of hearing my own name nearly sent me tumbling backward out of the cab. Nobody knew I was here. Nobody had any reason to expect me to stop at this truck, and yet somehow, impossibly, that voice knew exactly who I was. The glass was moving more actively now, shifting and sliding as if something was trying to work its way up through it from underneath, and I could see glimpses of fabric, maybe a sleeve or a piece of clothing, appearing and disappearing in the crystalline mass. "Marcus," the voice called again, more urgently this time. "Please, I can't get out." The frequency of Route 47, from Jake Morrison. The humming started on a Tuesday night somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno, a soft electrical drone that seemed to pulse from my glove compartment like a mechanical heartbeat. I'd been driving this route for the better part of 15 years, hauling refrigerated goods up and down California's Central Valley in my trusty Peterbilt, and I knew every sound my rig made. This wasn't one of them. The night was clear and cold, the kind of October evening where the air carries that sharp bite that makes you grateful for the diesel heater rumbling beneath your feet. Highway 99 stretched ahead like a black ribbon, punctuated by the occasional cluster of truck stoplights or the amber glow of a small farming town settling in for the night. My CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter between drivers, weather reports, and warnings about bears lurking near the inspection stations. Everything felt normal except for that persistent humming. At first, I thought it might be my phone charger acting up. The cord had been giving me trouble lately, making odd noises when it got jostled around. But when I reached over to check it, unplugging it entirely from the dashboard outlet, the humming continued. If anything, it seemed to grow slightly more pronounced, as if responding to my attention. The sound had a musical quality to it, almost like someone humming a lullaby just at the edge of hearing. I pulled over at the next rest area, a lonely stretch of cracked asphalt surrounded by eucalyptus trees whose leaves rustled in the gentle night breeze. The air smelled of diesel fuel, and the faint sweetness of agricultural fields stretching endlessly into the darkness. I shut down the engine and sat in the sudden quiet, listening. The humming was still there, definitely coming from the glove compartment, a soft electromagnetic whisper that seemed oddly comforting despite its strangeness. Opening the glove compartment revealed nothing unusual. My logbook, registration papers, a half-empty bottle of antacids, a small flashlight, and the usual collection of gas station receipts and truck stop business cards. I pushed things around, looking for anything that might be making the sound, but found nothing electronic except my backup GPS unit, which was powered off. Yet the humming persisted, seeming to emanate from the very walls of the compartment itself. I closed it and fired up the engine, figuring I'd have it looked at when I reached my destination in Sacramento. But as I pulled back onto the highway, something strange happened. The humming began to change pitch, rising and falling in a pattern that almost sounded like communication. Not quite musical, not quite mechanical, but something in between that made the hair on my arm stand up beneath my flannel sleeves. Miles passed beneath my wheels as I tried to focus on the road, but the humming kept drawing my attention. It would surge and fade, sometimes disappearing entirely for long stretches before returning with renewed intensity. I began to notice that it seemed to correspond with certain areas along my road. Near the small town of Coalinga, it grew stronger. As I passed the abandoned gas station at the junction of Highway 198, it practically sang. The strangest thing was how it made me feel. Despite its otherworldly quality, the humming was oddly soothing, almost hypnotic. I found myself driving more smoothly, taking curves with an unusual grace, shifting gears with perfect timing. It was as if the sound was somehow harmonizing with my truck, creating a symphony of man and machine that felt more natural than anything I'd experienced in my decades of driving. Around midnight, I stopped for fuel at a 24-hour truck stop near Tulare. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few other big rigs whose drivers were presumably catching some sleep in their cabs. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that harsh white glow that makes the world look like a photograph negative. As I filled my tanks, I noticed the humming had stopped entirely, leaving behind a silence that felt almost oppressive after hours of that gentle drone. Inside the truck stop, the clerk was a thin young man with tired eyes who barely looked up from his smartphone as I paid for my fuel. The coffee was old and bitter, but I needed the caffeine. Through the windows, I could see my truck sitting beneath the canopy lights, looking exactly as it always had. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, yet I found myself reluctant to go back outside. When I climbed back into the cab, the humming resumed immediately, as if it had been waiting for me. This time, though, it was different. More insistent, more purposeful. And for the first time, I could swear I heard something else beneath it. Voices, perhaps, or what might have been voices if they weren't so distorted and distant. They seemed to be coming from far away, filtered through layers of static and electronic interference. Back on the highway, the humming began to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat was synchronizing with it. The distinction became increasingly unclear as the miles rolled by. The voices grew more distinct, though I still couldn't make out words. They rose and fell like a conversation heard through water, urgent and pleading but incomprehensible. It was near Modesto that things took a decidedly unsettling turn. The humming suddenly spiked in volume, becoming almost aggressive in its intensity. The voices became clearer, and I realized with a chill that they were calling my name, not shouting, but speaking it with a familiarity that suggested they knew me well. "Jake," they whispered through the electromagnetic static. "Jake, can you hear us?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to focus on the road ahead. The logical part of my mind insisted that I was simply tired, that long-haul driving could play tricks on a person's perception. But the voices were so clear now, so distinct that I couldn't dismiss them as imagination. There were multiple speakers, men and women of various ages, all speaking my name with increasing urgency. The glove compartment began to emit a faint blue glow, barely visible but unmistakable in my peripheral vision. I reached over with a trembling hand and opened it, revealing the same mundane contents as before. But now they were bathed in that soft, phosphorescent light. The humming intensified until it filled the cab, vibrating through my bones and making my teeth ache. "Jake," the voices said, more clearly than ever, "we've been trying to reach you. We need you to understand." I pulled over onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking as traffic rushed past in a blur of headlights and red taillights. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. The glow from the glove compartment pulsed in time with the humming, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Despite my fear, I found myself leaning closer, drawn by a curiosity that overrode my instinct to run. The voices began to overlap, creating a chorus of whispers that rose and fell like ocean waves. They spoke of frequencies beyond normal human perception, of dimensional boundaries worn thin by years of electromagnetic radiation from countless vehicles traveling the same stretch of highway. They told me that my truck, with its particular combination of electronic systems and metallic composition, had become a receiver for their transmissions from somewhere beyond the veil of ordinary reality. "We're not trying to frighten you, Jake," they said. "We're trying to warn you. There's something else here. Something that's been drawn by the same frequencies that allow us to speak with you. It's been following you for miles now, staying just outside your peripheral vision, waiting for the right moment." I looked in my mirrors but saw only the familiar pattern of headlights behind me. Other truckers and late-night travelers going about their business. Yet there was something in the way one particular set of lights maintained its distance that made me uneasy. They never got closer, never fell further behind, just maintained that constant interval as if they were pacing me. The humming reached a crescendo that made my vision blur, and suddenly the voices cut off entirely, leaving only silence and the soft idle of my diesel engine. The glow from the glove compartment faded to black, and I was alone again, with the night and the highway and the growing, certainty that I was being hunted by something that existed just outside the boundaries of normal perception. I closed the glove compartment and pulled back onto the highway, pushing my truck harder than usual, watching those persistent headlights in my mirror. They matched my speed exactly, never wavering, never changing lanes, just maintaining that perfect following distance like a predator stalking its prey. The humming never returned that night. I reached Sacramento as dawn was breaking over the Sierra Nevada, delivered my load, and had my truck thoroughly inspected by the best mechanic I knew. He found nothing wrong with any of my electrical systems, nothing that could account for the sounds I'd heard or the lights I'd seen. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm driving that stretch of Highway 99 between Bakersfield and Fresno, I still hear it, the iron lullaby. From Marcus Chen, the Peterbilt's diesel engine had been humming its familiar rhythm for the past 8 hours as I guided her through the winding mountain roads of northern Oregon. My cargo of electronics destined for Seattle before dawn. The rain had started just after midnight, a gentle pattering against the windshield that gradually intensified into a steady drumming that seemed to sync with the truck's heartbeat. My wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, clearing away sheets of water only to have them replaced moments later by the relentless Pacific Northwest deluge. I'd been running this route for nearly 15 years, knew every curve and grade like the lines on my weathered hands. But tonight something felt different in the way the darkness pressed against my headlights. The familiar landmarks seemed to slide past in unfamiliar configurations, as if the landscape itself had shifted slightly while I wasn't paying attention. The radio had dissolved into static about an hour back, leaving me with only the comforting sounds of my rig and the increasingly insistent percussion of rain on metal and glass. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, my headlights swept across something that made me ease off the accelerator slightly. There, spanning a deep ravine I'd never noticed before, stood a railway bridge of blackened iron and weathered steel. The strange thing was, I couldn't remember ever seeing a bridge in this exact location, though the mountain roads could play tricks on your memory in the dark. The structure loomed against the storm-darkened sky like the skeleton of some massive prehistoric creature, its latticed girders creating intricate shadow patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in my headlight beams. The bridge appeared to be ancient, built in that distinctive style of the early railroad boom, all riveted joints and massive load-bearing beams that spoke of an era when engineering was as much art as science. Rust streaks ran down its sides like tears, and I could see where sections of the original paint still clung stubbornly to the metal, despite decades of weather and neglect. What struck me as particularly odd was that I couldn't see any tracks leading to or from the bridge, just the structure itself suspended over the chasm, as if it had been abandoned mid-construction and forgotten by time. I was about to continue past when a sound cut through the steady rhythm of rain and engine noise, something that made me instinctively reach for the brake pedal. It was high-pitched and metallic like the screech of train wheels against rails, but there was something unmistakably organic about it as well. Something that raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a chill down my spine despite the warmth of the cab. The sound seemed to be coming from the bridge itself, emanating from somewhere within that maze of iron and steel. Curiosity got the better of my road-weary common sense, and I pulled the rig over to the shoulder, engaging the parking brake and letting the engine idle while I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The sound came again, longer this time, and I realized with growing unease that it wasn't the screech of metal on metal at all. It was screaming. Human voices raised in what could only be described as anguish or terror, but somehow filtered through the bridge's structure until it took on that metallic, railway quality that had initially fooled my ears. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the door pocket and stepped out into the rain, immediately feeling the cold drop soak through my flannel shirt and run down the back of my neck. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness and rain, illuminating patches of the bridge's intricate ironwork in stark detail. Up close, I could see that the metal wasn't just weathered, but actually seemed to be moving slightly, the individual beams and girders expanding and contracting in a rhythm that had nothing to do with temperature changes or wind stress. The screaming sound rose again, and this time I was certain it was coming from within the bridge itself, as if voices were trapped somewhere in that labyrinth of metal and were crying out for release. I approached the structure cautiously, my boots splashing through puddles that reflected my flashlight beam back at me like scattered mirrors. The closer I got, the more details became visible in the harsh white light, and what I saw made my blood run cold in my veins. The rivets that held the bridge together weren't rivets at all, or at least not anymore. They were faces, dozens upon dozens of human faces pressed into the metal as if they had been absorbed by the iron itself. Each face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, mouths open in silent screams that somehow gave voice to the metallic wailing that continued to echo through the night air. Their eyes followed my movement, tracking back and forth as I played my flashlight beam across the bridge's surface. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the rain-slicked asphalt. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the horrific sight. The faces seemed to be trying to communicate something, their mouths moving in what might have been words if they could produce any sound other than that terrible metallic shrieking. Some of the faces looked recent, their features still clearly defined and recognizable as individuals who might have been alive just days or weeks ago. Others were older, more weathered, their details worn smooth by time until they were little more than vague impressions of humanity pressed into the unforgiving iron. As I watched in fascinated horror, one of the newer faces, that of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, seemed to mouth a single word over and over again. Run, run, run. The message was clear even though no sound emerged from her iron-trapped lips, and I felt my legs finally respond to my brain's increasingly frantic commands to get away from this place. I turned and sprinted back toward my truck, but as I ran I could hear something changing behind me. The screaming was getting louder, more insistent, and underneath it I could hear the unmistakable sound of metal grinding against metal, the groaning protest of massive structural elements under stress. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw something that nearly sent me sprawling face first into the pavement. The bridge was moving, not just the subtle expansion and contraction I'd noticed before, but actual locomotion. It was pulling itself across the landscape like some enormous iron caterpillar, its structure undulating and flexing as it pursued me with impossible persistence. The faces trapped in its surface were screaming louder now, their voices creating a symphony of terror that cut through the rain and wind like a blade. Some of them seemed to be warning me away, while others appeared to be calling me back, perhaps hoping I might somehow free them from their metallic prison. I reached my truck and threw myself into the cab, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the parking brake released and the transmission in gear. The engine roared as I floored the accelerator, and the Peterbilt lurched forward just as I felt something massive slam into the trailer behind me. The entire rig shuddered with the impact, but the old girl held together and kept moving, her 18 wheels finding purchase on the rain-slicked asphalt and pulling us away from whatever nightmare had tried to claim us. In my mirrors, I could see the bridge settling back into position over the ravine, once again appearing to be nothing more than an abandoned piece of railroad infrastructure slowly being reclaimed by the elements. The screaming faded gradually, replaced once again by the familiar sounds of engine and rain and wipers that had been my companions for so many miles and years. But I knew what I'd seen, knew what I'd heard, and I knew that those faces trapped in the iron would haunt my dreams for whatever time I had left. I didn't stop driving until I reached Seattle, and even then I sat in the truck stop parking lot for nearly an hour before I felt steady enough to get out and begin the unloading process. When I tried to tell other drivers about what I'd experienced, they just nodded politely and changed the subject, the way people do when they think someone's been on the road too long and is starting to see things that aren't there. But I know what I saw that night, and I've changed my route to avoid that particular stretch of mountain road. Sometimes, though, when I'm driving other routes in the small hours of the morning and the rain is particularly heavy, I think I can hear it again somewhere in the distance. That terrible iron lullaby of voices trapped in metal, still crying out for someone to hear them, still warning others away from their fate, still screaming their endless, metallic song into the indifferent darkness of the night, the words that drive you home. From Marcus Chen, the dashboard of my Peterbilt 389 had been acting up for weeks, but nothing that ever warranted a stop at the shop. Just little glitches in the digital display, numbers that would flicker for half a second before settling back to normal. Maybe a warning light that would blink once and disappear. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, and every truck develops its quirks after enough miles. The electronic systems in these newer rigs are sensitive to temperature changes, vibrations, electrical surges from poorly maintained truck stops. I figured it was just another case of modern technology trying to do too much and breaking down in creative ways. The night it all changed started like any other. I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Portland, running through the high desert of eastern Oregon under a sky so clear you could see every crater on the moon. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, mile markers ticking by in the steady rhythm that becomes a trucker's heartbeat. My CB crackled occasionally with distant conversations, drivers checking in with each other across the vastness, sharing reports of weather and road conditions and the eternal search for decent coffee. Around midnight, somewhere between Burns and Bend, the dashboard began its usual light show. The speedometer needle quivered, the fuel gauge dipped and recovered, and the small LCD screen that normally displayed trip information went momentarily dark before lighting up again. I'd grown so accustomed to these minor malfunctions that I barely glanced down, keeping my eyes focused on the hypnotic sweep of my headlights across the asphalt ahead. But something made me look down a few minutes later. Maybe a change in the quality of light reflecting off the instrument panel. The LCD screen was displaying text, which wasn't unusual. It often showed maintenance reminders or system status updates. What caught my attention was that the words seemed different somehow, though I couldn't immediately say why. The screen read, "Destination ahead," in the same green digital font it always used. But something about the spacing or the timing felt wrong. I blinked and looked again, and the screen had returned to showing my average fuel consumption. Perhaps I'd been driving too long without a proper break. My eyes playing tricks on me in the dim glow of the instrument lights. The engine hummed its steady diesel song, the familiar rumble that had lulled me through thousands of nights just like this one. Outside, the desert rolled past in endless waves of sagebrush and shadow, punctuated by the occasional distant glow of a ranch house or radio tower. 20 minutes later, the screen flickered again, and this time I was watching when the words appeared. "Almost home now" scrolled across the display in that same steady digital font. The message lingered for perhaps 5 seconds before being replaced by the current outside temperature. I felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the desert night, because home was still 8 hours away in Seattle, and my truck's navigation system had never been programmed to display encouraging messages about arrival times. I reached over and tapped the screen with my finger, cycling through the various display options. Odometer, trip distance, fuel economy, engine temperature. All the normal readings appeared in their proper sequence. Everything seemed normal. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that my truck was trying to tell me something beyond the mechanical data I expected from it. The highway curved through a series of low hills, and my headlights swept across the weathered faces of volcanic rock formations that looked like sleeping giants in the darkness. A light wind had picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain through my barely cracked window. The CB had gone quiet, leaving me alone with the steady thrum of my engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. When the next message appeared, I was ready for it. "Sarah is waiting," glowed briefly on the screen before disappearing into the normal rotation of system information. My hands tightened on the steering wheel because Sarah was my ex-wife and she'd been dead for 3 years. We'd divorced amicably enough, stayed in touch occasionally, and when the cancer took her, I'd been one of the people at her bedside. She wasn't waiting for anyone anywhere. And my truck's computer system had no possible way of knowing her name. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road, a gravel turnout marked with a historical marker about some forgotten mining claim. The engine idled roughly, as it always did when not under load, and I stared at the dashboard display as it cycled through its normal routine. Temperature, fuel level, oil pressure, all the mechanical vital signs that kept me moving down the highway. Nothing unusual, nothing that would suggest the system was malfunctioning in any way beyond the typical electronic hiccups I'd grown used to. But as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the high desert, another message flickered across the screen. "She remembers the cabin," appeared for just long enough for me to read it completely, then vanished into the normal display rotation. My breath caught in my throat because Sarah and I had owned a small cabin up in the Cascade Mountains, a place we'd bought during the good years of our marriage and reluctantly sold during the divorce proceedings. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Modern trucks are computers on wheels, connected to satellites and cellular networks, constantly transmitting diagnostic data to manufacturers and fleet managers. Maybe someone was hacking into the system, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would bother with such an elaborate prank on a single independent trucker. Maybe the display unit was picking up stray radio signals, somehow interpreting them as text messages, though that didn't explain how the words were so personal, so specific to my own history. I put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway, telling myself that I'd have the system checked at the next major stop. But the messages continued to appear with increasing frequency, each one more unsettling than the last. "The road remembers everything," scrolled past, followed 10 minutes later by, "You were supposed to stay." The text always appeared in the same font, the same steady green glow, as if the truck's computer was simply providing routine system updates about matters of the heart, rather than mechanical function. The highway began to climb toward the Cascade Passes, winding through forests of pine and Douglas fir that pressed close to the roadway. My headlights carved a tunnel of light through the darkness, illuminating the occasional reflective eyes of deer or elk watching from the tree line. The air grew cooler and thinner, carrying the scent of snow from the higher elevations, even though it was still early autumn. "Take the next exit," appeared on the screen just as I crested a hill and saw the familiar green sign for the Highway 22 turnoff, the road that led up toward the area where our cabin had been. I had no intention of taking that exit, hadn't been up that road since the day we'd handed over the keys to the new owners. But something made me slow down as I approached the off-ramp. The display flickered again, showing "She's still there" in letters that seemed somehow brighter, more insistent than before. I drove past the exit, maintaining my course toward Portland, but I couldn't shake the image of that lonely mountain road disappearing into the darkness. In my mirrors, I watched the exit ramp recede into the night, marked by a single amber streetlight that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat against the surrounding forest. The rational part of my mind knew that Sarah was buried in a cemetery outside Phoenix, that the cabin belonged to strangers now. That dashboard displays don't channel messages from the beyond, but the messages kept coming, each one drawing me back toward memories I'd thought I'd successfully buried beneath years of highway miles and solitary nights. "Remember the morning you left?" appeared as I passed another familiar landmark, a roadside diner where Sarah and I had stopped for breakfast on what turned out to be our last trip to the cabin together. The display held that message longer than the others, as if the truck's computer knew I needed time to fully absorb its meaning. My CB radio crackled to life with a burst of static, and for a moment I thought I heard a voice, a woman's voice, calling my name through the electronic noise. But when I grabbed the handset and responded asking for clarification, only silence came back. The radio fell quiet again, leaving me alone with the steady rhythm of my diesel engine and the increasingly frequent messages scrolling across my dashboard. As I descended the western slopes of the Cascades, with the lights of Portland beginning to glow on the horizon, one final message appeared on the screen. "Next time, take the exit," glowed in letters that seemed somehow different from all the others, sharper and more defined, before fading back to the normal display of mechanical data. I stared at those words until they disappeared, knowing with a certainty I couldn't explain that this wasn't over, that whatever force had found a way to speak through my truck's electrical system would be waiting for me on the next run through these mountains. I delivered my load without incident and drove home to Seattle as the sun rose over the Puget Sound, the carousel of steel and rubber from Marcus Big Mac McKenzie. The rain drummed against my windshield like restless fingers as I guided my Kenworth T880 through the winding mountain pass outside of Coalfield, Tennessee. It was well past 2 in the morning, and the hypnotic rhythm of my diesel engine mixing with the steady patter of precipitation should have been comforting. Instead, something felt wrong about this particular stretch of highway, something I couldn't quite place my finger on as I navigated the serpentine curves that cut through these ancient Appalachian hills. I'd been running this route for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from timber to manufactured goods between Nashville and the coal towns, scattered throughout these mountains. The highway was as familiar to me as my own reflection, every pothole and guardrail etched into my memory through countless midnight runs. But tonight the darkness seemed thicker somehow, more oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were leaning in closer to the asphalt ribbon that connected the outside world to these forgotten communities. The radio crackled with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices fading in and out as the terrain played havoc with the signal. I reached over to adjust the volume, hoping to catch a weather report or maybe just some human companionship to cut through the isolation, when my headlight swept across something that made me ease off the accelerator. There, just off the right shoulder of the road, sat what appeared to be an old truck tire, perfectly upright and motionless in the tall grass that bordered the highway. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than roadside debris, the kind of thing that accumulates along these mountain highways like driftwood on a beach. Truckers lose retreads all the time, and it wasn't uncommon to see the remnants scattered along the roadside. But as my beams moved past it and the darkness reclaimed that patch of grass, I found myself glancing in my side mirror, trying to catch another glimpse of what I'd seen. The tire had looked pristine, too clean and well-maintained to be abandoned refuse. I shook my head and refocused on the road ahead, telling myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on my perception. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, with only brief stops for fuel and a quick meal at a truck stop diner that served coffee strong enough to dissolve paint. The human mind has a way of finding patterns and significance in the most mundane things when it's running on caffeine and adrenaline, and I'd learned long ago not to trust every shadow or reflection that caught my attention during these long hauls. But then, about 2 miles further up the mountain, I saw another one. This tire sat closer to the road, positioned at the edge of the asphalt where the shoulder met the white line. Like the first, it stood perfectly upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there with deliberate precision. The tread pattern was clearly visible in my headlights, and I could see that it was a truck tire, probably a 22.5 semi-tire similar to the ones currently carrying my rig up this mountain road. A chill that had nothing to do with the October air conditioning began to creep up my spine. I slowed my truck to get a better look, and that's when I noticed something that made my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. The tire was rotating slowly but unmistakably, turning in place like a lazy Susan on an invisible axle. There was no wind strong enough to move such a heavy object, no slope that would cause it to roll, nothing that could explain the gentle, methodical revolution I was witnessing. I pulled my rig to a complete stop, hazard lights blinking rhythmically as I stared at the impossible sight. The tire continued its slow rotation, maybe one full turn every 10 or 15 seconds, the wet rubber glistening in my headlights like something alive. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was balanced on a piece of debris, or there was some kind of underground water flow causing the ground to shift beneath it. But even as I ran through these possibilities, I knew they were just desperate attempts to make sense of something that defied explanation. The radio crackled again, and I grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers. Breaker 19, this is Big Mac heading north on Route 27. Any drivers in the Coalfield area seeing anything unusual tonight? The static that answered me was somehow more unnerving than silence would have been, filled with whispers and fragments of conversations that seemed to come from very far away. I put the truck back in gear and accelerated slowly past the spinning tire, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. In my rearview mirror, I watched the tire fade into darkness, still turning its endless revolution. The mountains seemed to press closer around me, and the rain intensified, turning my windshield into a waterfall that even my wipers struggled to clear. Over the next 5 miles of winding highway, I counted 17 more tires, each one positioned along the roadside like sentinels marking my progress through this increasingly surreal landscape. Some spun clockwise, others counterclockwise, but all maintained that same hypnotic, purposeful rotation that seemed to mock the laws of physics. They varied in size. Some were clearly from passenger vehicles. Others looked like they belonged on construction equipment or farming machinery. But they all shared that same impossible animation, that same wet gleaming surface that reflected my headlights like watching eyes. The temperature gauge on my dashboard remained normal, but I could swear the air inside the cab was growing colder with each passing mile. My breath began to fog slightly as I exhaled, and the familiar warmth of my truck's heater seemed unable to penetrate the chill that was settling into my bones. The diesel engine's steady rumble, usually such a comforting constant, began to sound different somehow, as if it were echoing off invisible walls that hadn't been there before. As I crested a particularly steep grade, my headlights illuminated a sight that made me slam on the brakes so hard that my cargo shifted and groaned behind me. The road ahead was lined with tires, dozens of them on both sides of the highway, creating a corridor of spinning rubber that stretched as far as my lights could penetrate. They were perfectly aligned, spaced at regular intervals like some kind of bizarre honor guard, all rotating in perfect synchronization. But it wasn't just their organization that sent ice water through my veins. It was the sound. As I sat there with my engine idling, I could hear the whisper of rubber against wet pavement, multiplied dozens of times over into a susurrus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like listening to a congregation of ghosts sharing secrets in a language made of friction and rotation. I tried the radio again, cycling through every channel, desperate for any human voice to anchor me to reality. Instead, I found only static punctuated by brief bursts of what sounded like tire pressure readings and tread depth measurements, delivered in monotone voices that could have been human or electronic. 17:30 seconds remaining. Rotation optimal. Alignment within parameters. The phrases overlapped and faded, creating an eerie chorus that seemed to emanate from the spinning tires themselves. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to decide whether to push forward through this gauntlet of impossibilities or attempt a dangerous 3-point turn on the narrow mountain road. The decision was made for me when I noticed movement in my side mirrors. The tires behind me, the ones I'd already passed, were moving, not spinning in place anymore, but rolling slowly and deliberately, following my truck up the mountain like a procession of faithful disciples. Panic flooded my system with adrenaline, and I gunned the diesel engine, sending my rig lurching forward into the corridor of spinning tires. As I passed between them, they seemed to lean inward slightly, as if straining to touch my truck, and the sound of their revolution grew louder, more insistent. I could feel a peculiar vibration through the steering wheel, as if the road itself was trembling in response to whatever force was animating these abandoned circles of rubber. The speedometer climbed past safe speeds for these mountain curves, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. In my mirrors, I could see the tires falling into formation behind me, a growing parade of rolling rubber that followed my truck with unwavering determination. Some bounced slightly as they hit irregularities in the pavement. Others maintained perfect contact with the asphalt, but all of them kept pace with my increasingly frantic flight up the mountain. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon ended. I rounded a sharp curve and found myself on familiar highway again, with normal shoulders and regulation guardrails, and not a single tire to be seen anywhere. The pursuing column of rubber had vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only the memory of that horrible whispering sound and the lingering scent of wet pavement and aged rubber that seemed to cling to the inside of my cab. The route that weeps from Marcus Holloway. The thing about Route 47 through the Cascade foothills is that it always seems to be crying, even when the weather reports call for clear skies. I've been running freight through these mountains for the better part of 15 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this particular stretch of asphalt has a moisture problem that defies all logic and explanation. The State Highway Department has resurveyed it twice, checked the drainage systems, even brought in geological teams to examine the rock formations above. Nothing. No springs, no underground streams. No explanation for why this 7-mile section perpetually weeps clear droplets that patter against your windshield like tears from an invisible giant. Tonight was supposed to be different. The dispatch office had been getting complaints from drivers about the route, enough that corporate decided to offer a bonus for anyone willing to make regular runs through that corridor. Double time for what should have been a routine haul of electronics from Seattle to Portland. I figured the other drivers were just being superstitious, letting their imaginations run wild during those long midnight shifts when your mind starts playing tricks on you. The money was too good to pass up, and my rig, a deep blue Peterbilt 379 that I'd named Minerva, had never let me down in conditions far worse than some unexplained precipitation. The dripping started the moment I crossed the mile marker that designated the beginning of the problematic section. At first it sounded exactly like what you'd expect from any mountain pass after a light rain, just water finding its way down from the rocky overhangs and sparse pine trees that lined the highway. But as I settled into the gentle rhythm of the engine and let my eyes adjust to the interplay of headlights and darkness, I began to notice the peculiarities that had probably spooked the other drivers. The droplets weren't random. They fell in patterns, creating rivulets down my windshield that seemed almost deliberate, like script written in a language I couldn't quite decipher. The wipers swept them away every few seconds, but they reformed immediately, always in the same configurations, always with that same gentle but persistent tapping that began to sound less like water and more like fingertips drumming against glass. The radio, which had been playing a late-night talk show about conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena, started to fade in and out, the voices becoming distorted and stretched as if the words themselves were dissolving in moisture. I reached for the CB radio to contact other drivers, hoping to hear some normal conversation to ground myself, but the channel was filled with nothing but static that had an oddly wet quality to it, like the sound of rain on leaves amplified through cheap speakers. The temperature gauge on the dashboard showed normal readings, but the air inside the cab felt thick and humid, despite the October chill outside. My breath began to fog slightly when I exhaled, though the heater was working perfectly and set to a comfortable 72 degrees. The first time I saw movement in the droplets, I convinced myself it was just the refraction of light creating optical illusions. The headlights from Minerva's massive front end were powerful enough to illuminate the road far ahead, and when they caught the falling moisture just right, it almost looked like there were shapes moving within each individual droplet as it traced its path down the windshield. Tiny silhouettes that writhed and twisted as if something alive was struggling inside those microscopic prisons of water. But as the miles passed, and the patterns became more complex, denial became impossible. The rivulets were forming images now, unmistakably deliberate designs that would appear for just a moment before being swept away by the wipers, only to reform seconds later with even greater clarity. I saw faces first. Human faces with expressions of desperate sadness that seemed to be pleading silently for something I couldn't understand. Then came hands, reaching upward as if trying to escape from beneath the surface of my windshield, pressing against the glass from the inside, even though logic dictated they had to be forming on the exterior surface. The engine began to respond sluggishly to my attempts to maintain speed. Though all the gauges indicated everything was functioning normally, it felt as if Minerva was driving through increasingly thick liquid rather than air, the familiar power of her engine muffled and dampened by some invisible resistance. The steering wheel grew slick beneath my palms despite the fact that I wasn't perspiring, and when I looked down I realized that moisture was beginning to seep through solid surfaces inside the cab. Droplets were forming on the ceiling, on the seat upholstery, even on the metal surfaces of the gear shifter and dashboard controls. The most unnerving discovery came when I noticed that the moisture had no scent whatsoever. Water from these mountains should have carried the smell of pine, of earth, of the mineral richness of stone and soil. This liquid was completely odorless, as if it had been distilled of everything that might identify its source or nature. When a droplet fell from the ceiling onto my hand, it felt exactly like water should feel, the right temperature and consistency, but it left no trace when I wiped it away, no dampness on my skin or clothing. I tried to radio for assistance, but the CB had gone completely silent now, not even static coming through the speakers. My cell phone showed no signal bars, though I knew from previous trips that this stretch of highway had decent coverage from the towers on the surrounding peaks. The digital clock on the dashboard had begun to flicker, the numbers occasionally blurring as if moisture had somehow gotten inside the sealed electronics. Time itself seemed to be moving differently, each mile marker taking either forever to reach or appearing much sooner than it should have based on my speedometer reading. The breakthrough, or breakdown, came when I realized I could hear something in the sound of the droplets hitting the windshield. At first I thought it was just my imagination overlaying meaning onto random noise, the way you might hear voices in flowing water or music in the hum of electrical wires. But as I forced myself to listen more carefully, fighting against every instinct that screamed at me to focus on the road and ignore these impossibilities, I began to make out actual words. They were whispered so softly that they barely registered above the ambient sounds of the engine and tires on wet pavement. But they were definitely there. Definitely human voices speaking in urgent, overlapping conversations that I could almost but not quite understand. The words seemed to be coming from every droplet simultaneously, thousands of tiny voices all speaking at once, creating a chorus of desperate communication that my brain couldn't quite process into coherent meaning. Then I saw the lights ahead, and my relief at encountering another vehicle quickly turned to something much more disturbing. The approaching headlights were wrong somehow, too dim and casting illumination that seemed to bend and waver as if being filtered through water. As the vehicle drew closer, I could see that it was another semi-truck, but its outline kept shifting and blurring, becoming less solid with each passing second, until I began to wonder if I was seeing an actual truck or just the ghost of one. A memory of a vehicle preserved in moisture and replayed endlessly on this stretch of highway. The other truck passed me without any acknowledgement from its driver, and I caught a glimpse through what should have been the driver's side window. Instead of glass in the interior of a cab, there was only flowing water, as if the entire vehicle was hollow and filled with the same mysterious liquid that had been tormenting me for miles. The sight sent a shock of pure terror through my system that was so intense I nearly lost control of my steering. But somehow Minerva held her course and kept moving forward through the increasingly surreal landscape. I began to understand that I needed to escape this route immediately. But when I looked for the next exit ramp or side road, I found nothing but unbroken guardrails and forest extending infinitely into the darkness. The mile markers had stopped making sense, displaying numbers that jumped forward and backward without any apparent logic, sometimes showing the same number repeatedly as if I was trapped in a loop of highway that repeated endlessly. The fuel gauge, which had read 3/4 full when I entered this section, now showed nearly empty, though I had only been driving for what felt like an hour at most. The voices in the droplets were growing louder and more insistent, and I began to catch fragments of actual sentences. They were warnings, I realized. Urgent messages from other drivers who had become trapped in the same impossible situation. Some of the voices sounded contemporary, using modern trucking terminology and references to current technology, while others seemed to come from decades past, mentioning truck models and highway conditions from long before my time on the road. Just when I thought I might be losing my grip on sanity entirely, I spotted something ahead that looked like salvation. A bridge, old and narrow but definitely real, spanning what appeared to be a small river valley. More importantly, beyond the bridge I could see normal-looking highway with proper mile markers and what looked like the glow of civilization in the distance. I pressed the accelerator harder than I should have, pushing Minerva to her limits in my desperate desire to escape this nightmarish stretch of road. The moment we crossed the bridge, everything changed instantly. The Screaming Mile, from Jake Martinez. The first thing you learn as a long-haul trucker is that your rig becomes an extension of yourself after enough miles. Every vibration through the steering wheel, every shift in the engine's rhythm, every subtle change in how the trailer pulls behind you becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. So when something feels wrong with your fuel, you know it immediately deep in your bones, even before your instruments start telling you stories you don't want to hear. I was running a standard freight haul from Bakersfield to Phoenix on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of run I'd done 100 times before. My Peterbilt 379 had been purring like a contented cat for the better part of 300 miles, diesel flowing smooth and clean through her arteries, when I started noticing the fuel gauge behaving strangely, not dropping too fast or too slow, but flickering in tiny increments as if something was interfering with the sensor. The needle would jump a hair to the left, then settle back, then jump again, creating this nervous little dance that caught my eye every time I glanced at the dash. Highway 58 stretched ahead of me through the Mojave, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through endless scrubland under a sky so thick with stars, it looked like someone had spilled glitter across black velvet. The radio was picking up nothing but static, and the occasional snippet of some distant AM station playing music that sounded like it was being transmitted from another decade. My CB crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, but their voices seemed muffled somehow, as if they were speaking through cotton or calling from very far away. The temperature gauge was reading normal, oil pressure steady, but something felt different about the way the engine was running. There was a subtle change in pitch, almost musical, like the diesel was singing as it burned. At first I thought maybe I was just tired, that my ears were playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road, but the sound kept getting more pronounced. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just unusual. A high harmonic note threading through the usual deep rumble of the Caterpillar engine. I'd filled up about 60 miles back at a truck stop I'd never used before, one of those older independent stations that seemed to exist in their own pocket of time, unchanged by the march of corporate branding that swallowed up most of the highway fuel stops. The attendant had been an older gentleman with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to look right through you, and he'd insisted on pumping the diesel himself, something you don't see much anymore. Said he took pride in making sure every truck got exactly what it needed, measured his words carefully like he was sharing some kind of secret. The fuel had looked normal going into the tank, that familiar amber flow catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the pump island. But now I was starting to wonder if there had been something different about it. The smell, maybe, or the way it seemed to catch the light just a little differently than I was used to. Diesel fuel has its own particular scent, earthy and industrial, but what I'd pumped had carried just a hint of something else, something almost organic, like the smell of rain on hot pavement or ozone before a lightning strike. As I crested a small rise in the highway, the singing from my engine grew more distinct, and I realized it wasn't just one note anymore but a complex harmony, multiple pitches weaving together in patterns that seemed almost deliberately melodic. The fuel gauge was oscillating more rapidly now. the needle performing an erratic dance that had no relationship to how much diesel should actually be left in my tanks. I tapped the glass face of the gauge with one finger, hoping to settle it. But the motion only seemed to make the fluctuations more pronounced. That's when I heard the first scream. It was faint at first, barely audible above the engine noise and the whisper of wind around the cab, but unmistakably human, a thin, high wail that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the mechanical depths of my truck, as if someone was trapped in the fuel system itself. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe I was picking up some kind of distress call on the CB, or that another driver was in trouble somewhere nearby. But the highway behind me was empty, just my own running lights reflecting off the guardrails and the endless darkness of the desert night. The screaming came again, longer this time and definitely emanating from my own engine, not the protests of metal under stress or the whistle of escaping pressure, but actual human voices, thin and desperate and afraid, multiple voices now. A chorus of anguish rising and falling with the RPMs as I maintained my speed down the long desert grade. Every time I pressed the accelerator, the screaming intensified, and when I eased off, it faded to a whisper but never completely disappeared. I pulled over to the shoulder and let the truck idle, my hands shaking as I reached for the CB microphone. The screaming continued even at idle, a soft susurrus of voices that seemed to be speaking in languages I didn't recognize, pleading in tones that needed no translation. I tried to raise another driver on channel 19, but all I got back was static mixed with what sounded like more distant screaming, as if the very airwaves had been contaminated with whatever was flowing through my fuel lines. The maintenance manual was in the sleeper, but I already knew there was nothing in there about fuel that screamed. This wasn't a mechanical problem that could be fixed with tools and replacement parts. This was something else entirely, something that defied every rule of internal combustion and thermodynamics I'd ever learned. The diesel was burning, my truck was running, but somehow the fuel itself had become a conduit for voices that had no business existing in the physical world. I thought about calling for roadside assistance, but what would I tell them? That my truck was running fine except for the fact that my fuel tank seemed to be full of tortured souls? That every gallon I burned released a chorus of screaming that grew louder and more desperate with each mile? They'd send me for a drug test and a psychological evaluation, and I'd lose my CDL faster than you could say corporate liability. The engine temperature was starting to climb, just a few degrees above normal, but enough to make me nervous. The screaming was getting more intense, more urgent, as if whatever was trapped in my fuel system knew that time was running out. Individual voices were becoming distinguishable now, crying out names I didn't recognize, speaking words in what might have been Spanish or Portuguese or something older and more primal. Some of them sounded like children. I had to make a decision. I could shut down right here on the shoulder and wait for help I couldn't properly ask for, or I could try to make it to the next truck stop and hope they had a mechanic who'd seen something like this before, though I was fairly certain no one had ever seen anything like this before. The screaming fuel seemed to be burning hotter than normal diesel, giving me more power, but at a cost I was only beginning to understand. Against every instinct telling me to kill the engine and walk away from my truck, I pulled back onto the highway. The screaming reached a crescendo as I accelerated, then settled into that horrible harmonic pattern, voices weaving together in songs of lamentation that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The fuel gauge was spinning now, the needle rotating continuously as if it couldn't decide whether my tanks were full or empty, or something in between those two states of being. 20 miles ahead, I could see the glow of lights that marked a major truck stop, one of the big chain operations with multiple pump islands and a repair bay that stayed open all night. If I could just make it that far, maybe I could find someone who would believe me, or at least someone who could drain my tanks and replace the screaming diesel with normal fuel that burned quietly and didn't carry the voices of the damned. The temperature gauge climbed another few degrees, and the screaming took on a note of panic, as if whatever was trapped in my fuel lines understood that their time was running out. The engine was working harder now, the turbo whining as it forced more air into the combustion chambers, feeding the fires that consumed the impossible fuel. Each mile brought me closer to safety, but also closer to whatever would happen when the last of the screaming diesel was burned away. I pulled into the truck stop with my engine running ragged, the temperature gauge hovering just below the red line, and the screaming so loud I had to cover my ears. The fuel pumps stood in neat rows under harsh LED lights, and I could see other trucks scattered around the lot, their drivers sleeping peacefully in cabs that ran on normal, quiet diesel that didn't carry cargo of human suffering. But as I rolled to a stop next to the pump island, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The older gentleman from the truck stop 60 miles back was standing next to the diesel pumps, his weathered hands folded in front of him, and that same knowing look in his eyes. The breathing ground for Marcus. The CB radio crackled with static as I pulled my Peterbilt into the rest area just past mile marker 247 on Interstate 80, somewhere in the endless stretch of Nebraska farmland that seems to go on forever, under the midnight sky. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Des Moines to Denver, and my eyelids were getting heavy in that dangerous way that every trucker knows means it's time to pull over, no matter how close you think you are to making your delivery window. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed 12:43 a.m. in pale green numbers, and the engine's steady rumble had been lulling me toward microsleep for the past 20 miles. The rest area looked standard enough in my headlights as I approached, with the usual setup of concrete picnic tables, a small brick building housing the restrooms, and a handful of parking spaces for cars and trucks, separated by a line of scraggly pine trees that the State Highway Department had planted years ago in a half-hearted attempt at landscaping. A single sodium vapor light cast everything in that familiar orange glow that makes every roadside stop look the same, whether you're in Nebraska or Nevada or anywhere in between. The pavement was cracked and weathered with weeds pushing up through the gaps, and I could see the remnants of old tire marks and oil stains that told the story of thousands of travelers who had stopped here before me, all of them just trying to make it safely to wherever they were going. I backed my rig into one of the truck spaces, set the air brakes with that familiar hiss of compressed air, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was almost shocking after so many hours of road noise and diesel rumble, and for a moment I just sat there in the cab, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. That's when I first noticed the smell, seeping in through the air vents even though I had them set to recirculate. It was a strange, cloying odor that reminded me of overripe fruit, mixed with something earthier and more unpleasant, like the smell of a compost pile that had gone bad, or the inside of a greenhouse where plants had been left to rot in humid heat. I figured it was probably just agricultural runoff from the surrounding farmland, maybe a feedlot somewhere upwind, or perhaps the rest area's septic system was having problems. These rural stops weren't always maintained as well as they should be, and I'd encountered worse smells at truck stops from coast to coast. I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the asphalt with a hollow sound that seemed to echo more than it should in the open space, and immediately the smell hit me full force, so thick I could almost taste it on my tongue. It was definitely organic, definitely decomposing, but there was something else underneath it that I couldn't quite identify, something that made the back of my throat itch and my sinuses burn. The night air was still and humid, unusual for Nebraska in early October, with no breeze to carry the smell away or bring in fresh air from the surrounding fields. As I walked toward the restroom building, my footsteps seemed unusually loud on the concrete, and I noticed that the usual sounds of the highway were muted here, as if the rest area existed in some kind of acoustic bubble that dampened the noise of passing traffic. The orange light from the sodium vapor lamp flickered occasionally, casting moving shadows that played tricks on my peripheral vision and made me keep looking over my shoulder even though I knew I was alone. The restroom door was propped open with a concrete block, which struck me as odd, since most rest areas keep their facilities locked at night to prevent vandalism, but I was grateful not to have to fumble for a light switch in the dark. Inside, the smell was even stronger, so potent that my eyes began to water and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that seems designed to set your nerves on edge, and they cast harsh shadows in the corners where the concrete walls met the floor. The mirrors above the sinks were spotted with what looked like condensation, but when I looked closer, the droplets seemed too thick, too viscous, more like some kind of organic discharge than simple water vapor. I finished my business as quickly as possible and headed back outside, but the smell followed me, clinging to my clothes and hair like smoke from a campfire. Walking back toward my truck, I noticed that the grass around the picnic tables looked wrong somehow, darker than it should be in the orange light, and when I knelt down to get a closer look, I realized it wasn't just dark but actually wet, saturated with some kind of moisture that couldn't be dew, since the air was too warm and there hadn't been any rain in the forecast. The ground felt soft under my boots, softer than dirt should feel, with a slight give that reminded me uncomfortably of walking on a mattress or a thick carpet. That's when I felt it for the first time. A subtle movement beneath my feet, so slight I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It was like a gentle swelling, as if the earth itself were breathing, rising and falling with a rhythm that was slow and steady and undeniably organic. I stepped back quickly, my heart rate picking up, and watched the area where I'd been standing. For several seconds, nothing happened, and I began to think I'd let the long hours of driving and the strange smell play tricks on my mind. Then I saw it again, a barely perceptible rise and fall of the ground, synchronized across the entire grassy area like the movement of a vast chest-drawing breath. I walked quickly back to my truck, telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation, maybe some kind of underground water source or a natural gas seepage that was causing the ground to shift. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, the smell was getting stronger, so powerful now that it seemed to coat the inside of my mouth and nose with a greasy film that made me want to spit. I climbed back into my cab and closed the doors, but the odor had somehow gotten inside, permeating the upholstery and filling the enclosed space with that sickly sweet stench of decay. I started the engine, thinking I would try to find another place to rest, maybe a truck stop 20 or 30 miles down the road, but as the headlights came on, they illuminated something that made me freeze with my hand on the gear shift. The grass around the picnic tables was moving now, not just rising and falling, but actually writhing like a living thing, and I could see dark patches spreading outward from some central point, growing larger and darker as I watched. The concrete of the walkways was beginning to crack and buckle, and through the gaps I could see something that looked like thick, black liquid bubbling up from underground. The smell was overwhelming now, so intense that I started gagging involuntarily, and I could feel my eyes streaming with tears that burned as they ran down my cheeks. I put the truck in gear and started to pull forward, but as I turned toward the exit, I saw in my mirrors that the dark patches were spreading faster now, covering not just the grass but the picnic tables and sidewalks, and even beginning to creep across the parking lot toward where my trailer had been sitting. Whatever was coming up from underground was flowing like water, but moving with purpose, as if it were actively pursuing me rather than simply spreading randomly. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the diesel engine respond with a surge of power, and pulled out of the rest area onto the highway without bothering to check for traffic. In my side mirrors, I could see the entire stop, disappearing under a spreading pool of darkness that seemed to absorb the orange light from the sodium vapor lamp until even that was swallowed up and the rest area vanished into blackness behind me. The smell began to fade as I put distance between myself and that place. But it took nearly 50 miles before I could breathe normally again, and the taste of it lingered in my mouth for the rest of the night. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, delivered my load, and immediately called the Nebraska Department of Transportation to report what I'd seen. The woman who answered the phone was polite but skeptical, and when she called me back 2 hours later, she told me that their maintenance crew had checked the rest area at mile marker 247 and found everything normal. No unusual odors or ground conditions reported. She suggested that I might have been experiencing fatigue-related hallucinations and recommended that I get more sleep between runs. But I know what I saw and smelled at that rest area, and I've been driving this route for 15 years without ever encountering anything like it. I've started taking a different highway when I have loads going west, adding an extra 100 miles to my trip just to avoid that stretch of Interstate 80. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through rural areas, I catch a faint whiff of that same smell on the wind, and I find myself checking my mirrors more often than I should, watching for dark patches spreading across the pavement in my wake, wondering if whatever was underground at that rest area is still down there, still breathing. The numbers never lie. From Jake Hendricks. The CB radio had been counting for 3 hours straight when I finally decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. Static would crackle. Then a calm monotone voice would say, 743. Then silence for exactly 60 seconds before the next number. I'd been driving this stretch of Interstate 80 through Nevada since midnight. My 18-wheeler loaded with electronics bound for Sacramento, and that voice had become as steady as my diesel engine's rumble. Most drivers would have switched channels by now, but there was something hypnotic about the precision of it. The voice never wavered, never hurried, never paused longer or shorter than that measured minute. 744, 745, 746. I found myself anticipating each number, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel in time with the countdown. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, painted silver under a full moon that hung like a watchful eye in the star-drunk sky. My headlights carved through the darkness ahead, illuminating the familiar ribbon of asphalt that I'd traveled hundreds of times over my 15 years of long-haul trucking. The night air was cool enough that I'd cracked the windows, letting the sage-scented breeze mix with the diesel fumes and the ever-present hum of my Peterbilt's engine. 752. The voice was male. I was certain of that now, with a slight rasp that suggested either age or too many cigarettes. But there was something else in that voice, something that made the hair on my forearms prickle despite the warmth of the cab. It wasn't just monotone. It was empty, hollow, like sound echoing up from the bottom of a well. I reached for the CB handset, hesitating with my thumb over the talk button. Protocol suggested I should break in, ask who was broadcasting and why, maybe offer assistance if this was some kind of emergency. But something deep in my gut told me to stay quiet, to keep listening. 753, 754. The number had been in the 600s when I first noticed it somewhere around Lovelock. Simple curiosity had kept me tuned to Channel 19 instead of switching to one of the truckers' usual haunts on 13 or 17. Now, 3 hours later, I was approaching the turnoff for Fernley, and that voice had climbed steadily higher without a single break or interruption. 758. I checked my odometer and felt a chill run down my spine. The numbers weren't random, they were counting miles. Specifically, they were counting the miles I'd driven since leaving Reno. I pulled over at the next rest stop, my hands trembling slightly as I shifted into park and let the engine idle. The rest area was deserted except for a single RV parked at the far end, its windows dark. Sodium lights cast harsh yellow circles on the pavement, creating deep shadows between the picnic tables and restroom facilities. I grabbed my logbook and started calculating, cross-referencing my departure time with my current location and average speed. 761. The math worked out perfectly. Somehow, impossibly, that voice had been tracking my exact mileage since the moment I'd pulled out of the truck stop in Reno. But that was impossible. CB radios don't work that way. And even if they did, who would bother monitoring a single truck's progress across the Nevada desert? I tried switching channels, spinning the dial through the truck bands and back to Channel 9 for emergencies. Nothing but the usual scattered chatter and static. But when I returned to 19, the voice was still there, patient and unwavering. 762. My hands were sweating now despite the cool night air. I keyed the mic. my voice sounding strange and thin in the quiet cab. "This is Moondog Express, eastbound on 80. Who's doing the counting?" Silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity, though my watch showed it was exactly 60 seconds. Then, 763. No acknowledgement, no explanation, just that same hollow voice continuing its relentless count. I tried again, broadcasting on different channels, asking for anyone who might know about the counting voice. A few drivers responded from scattered locations across the state, but none of them could hear what I was hearing. When they tuned to Channel 19, they reported nothing but static. 764. I felt completely alone now, isolated in my cab with only that voice for company. The sensation was like being watched by something I couldn't see, something that knew exactly where I was and where I was going. I thought about calling my dispatcher, but what would I say? That a ghost was tracking my mileage over the CB? The smart thing would be to shut off the radio entirely, but I found I couldn't bring myself to do it. The voice had become a lifeline of sorts, the only proof I had that this wasn't all in my head. 765. 766. Each number fell into the silence like a stone dropped into dark water. I pulled back onto the highway, my truck's headlights sweeping across the empty pavement ahead. The desert had taken on a different quality now, less peaceful and more threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide something watching. Every distant light might be following me. The stars above looked cold and distant, offering no comfort. 770. The voice was getting clearer now, more distinct, as if its source was drawing closer. I could hear breathing between the numbers, slow and deliberate. Could hear what might have been the crackle of other electronic equipment in the background. Wherever that transmission was coming from, it wasn't a simple handheld CB. My fuel gauge was showing 3/4 full, more than enough to reach Sacramento. But suddenly, the idea of continuing seemed impossible. Every mile I drove was another number in that relentless count, another step deeper into whatever strange territory I'd wandered into. But stopping felt even worse. Being stationary would make me an easy target for whatever was tracking my progress. 775. The breathing was definitely audible now, raspy and labored. I found myself breathing in sync with it, my own rhythm gradually matching that of the voice. The hypnotic quality was stronger than ever, and I had to shake my head to clear it, to maintain my focus on the road ahead. That's when I saw the truck in my mirrors. It was staying exactly a 1/4 mile back, matching my speed perfectly. In the darkness, I could only make out its headlights and the vague silhouette of a cab, but something about its presence felt deliberately menacing. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it maintained that exact distance. 782. The count had continued without pause while I'd been watching my shadow. I grabbed the mic again, abandoning any pretense of calm. "Listen, whoever you are, I don't know what kind of game this is, but I want no part of it. Find someone else to mess with." The 60-second pause stretched out like always, but this time when the voice returned, it was different. Closer. More personal. 783, Jake. My blood turned to ice water. I'd never given my name over the radio. My CB handle was Moondog Express, had been for years, and my company name was painted on the truck's doors. But this voice knew me, had somehow learned my real name during this nightmare drive across the desert. 784, Jake. 785, Jake. Each repetition of my name felt like a violation, like invisible fingers reaching into my cab and touching me. The truck behind me held its position, neither gaining nor falling back, a constant presence in my mirrors. I floored the accelerator, pushing my loaded rig as fast as I dared on the dark highway. The engine roared and my trailer swayed slightly as we climbed toward 80 miles per hour. Behind me, the following truck matched my speed effortlessly, those two headlights burning like eyes in the night. 791, Jake. 792. Jake. The voice was excited now, anticipating something. The breathing had quickened, and I could swear I heard other sounds in the background. Clicking, like relays switching or like fingers tapping on metal. Ahead, I could see the lights of sparks beginning to glow on the horizon. Civilization, other people, witnesses. If I could just reach the truck stop at the Pyramid Lake exit, I could get help, call the police, do something other than race through the darkness with that voice counting down my remaining miles. But as the numbers climbed higher, I began to understand that reaching the truck stop might not be the salvation I hoped for. The count wasn't just tracking where I'd been, it was building toward something. 798, Jake. Eyes in the cargo. From Marcus Webb. The thing about hauling freight cross-country is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you develop a sixth sense about your cargo. You feel the weight distribution in how she handles the curves. Hear the subtle shifts in the trailer when you brake, and know instinctively when something's not quite right back there. That sensitivity served me well through 2 decades of clean driving records and satisfied customers. But on that fog-shrouded October night somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow, I began to wish I'd chosen a different line of work. The manifest said I was carrying art installations bound for a gallery opening in Phoenix. Expensive pieces that required climate control and gentle handling. The client had paid premium rates for my services, cash up front, which should have been my first warning sign. In trucking, legitimate businesses don't usually deal in cash, but the economy had been rough and my mortgage payment was due. I loaded the cargo in a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, where men in expensive suits supervised the careful placement of 7 large crates, each roughly the size of a refrigerator, wrapped in heavy canvas and secured with industrial strapping. The fog had rolled in thick as I climbed into the San Gabriel Mountains, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet ahead of my headlights. My Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm, a comforting sound that usually helped pass the lonely hours, but tonight it seemed muffled by the oppressive gray wall surrounding me. The radio crackled with static, occasionally catching fragments of distant conversations between other drivers navigating the treacherous conditions. I'd slowed to 40 miles per hour, my amber running lights creating ghostly halos in the mist. It was around midnight when I first noticed the sound from the trailer. At first I thought it might be the air suspension adjusting to the mountain grade, but as I listened more carefully it seemed almost rhythmic, like breathing. I told myself, it was just the trailer's aluminum sides contracting in the mountain air. But the sound persisted, a slow, measured cadence that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. I reached for the CB radio to chat with another driver. Anything to break the hypnotic monotony of that fog-wrapped highway, but found only static across all channels. The feeling of being watched crept over me gradually, starting as a subtle prickle between my shoulder blades that I tried to dismiss as tension from hunching over the steering wheel in poor visibility, but the sensation grew stronger, more focused, as if unseen eyes were boring into the back of my head through the small window that separated the cab from the trailer. I adjusted my mirrors, checking the road behind me, but saw only the red glow of my taillights disappearing into the gray void. When I stopped at a lonely truck stop near Victorville to check my load and grab coffee, I walked slowly around the trailer, my flashlight beam cutting through wisps of fog that clung to the asphalt. The cargo appeared secure, the straps tight, and the canvas coverings undisturbed, but something felt different. The air around the trailer seemed charged with an electric tension, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, and I could swear I heard that rhythmic breathing sound even with the engine off. I pressed my ear to the trailer's side and immediately jerked back. The metal was warm to the touch despite the cool mountain air, and beneath it I could feel a subtle vibration, as if something inside was gently pulsing. Back in the cab with my coffee growing cold in the cup holder, I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Art installations could be complex, incorporating motors or electronic components that might generate heat and sound. The wealthy clients who commissioned such pieces often favored interactive or kinetic sculptures. But as I pulled back onto the highway and the fog closed around me again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those crates was very much alive. The sensation of being watched intensified as I descended toward the desert floor. It was no longer just a feeling of eyes on my back, but something more immediate and personal, as if whatever was in those crates could see through the canvas wrappings and the trailer walls directly into my cab. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the rearview mirror, not looking for traffic but checking the small window behind my seat. The paranoia was getting to me, I knew, but I couldn't help feeling that if I turned around quickly enough, I might catch a glimpse of something peering back at me through that dark opening. The truck stop outside Barstow appeared through the fog like an island of harsh fluorescent light in an ocean of gray. I pulled into the weighing area, intending to grab a few hours of sleep before continuing to Phoenix. But as I went through my pre-rest inspection, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The canvas covering on the middle crate had shifted slightly, revealing a gap in the wooden slats beneath. And through that gap, something gleamed in the beam of my flashlight. At first, I thought it might be polished metal or glass, part of whatever sculpture lay within. But as I moved the light, the gleam seemed to move with it, tracking the beam like an eye following motion. I stood frozen beside the trailer for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, watching that dark gap for any further movement. The rhythmic breathing sound had returned, more pronounced now, and I realized it was coming from inside the crates themselves. Not from settling wood or contracting metal, but from something organic, something that drew air into what might have been lungs and expelled it in measured, deliberate breaths. The warmth I'd felt earlier was radiating through the canvas now, and beneath my feet, I could feel subtle vibrations in the asphalt as something large shifted position inside the cargo hold. When I climbed back into the cab, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. Whatever was in those crates, it wasn't art installations bound for a gallery opening. The expensive suits, the cash payment, the remote pickup location, it all made sense now in the worst possible way. I'd been hired to transport something that legitimate shipping companies wouldn't touch, something that required a driver who wouldn't ask questions and wouldn't look too closely at the manifest. As I pulled back onto the highway, desperate now, to reach Phoenix and unload my cargo before dawn, the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I could sense attention focused on me with predatory intensity, multiple sources of awareness that followed my every movement from mere feet behind my seat. The small window that had always been just a practical feature of the cab's design now felt like a vulnerability, a portal through which unseen intelligences could observe my growing panic. The fog began to lift as I descended into the desert, revealing star-scattered darkness that should have been comforting but instead felt vast and hostile. In my side mirrors, I caught glimpses of movement within the trailer, shadows shifting across the small windows near the roof. The canvas coverings on several crates had loosened further, and through the gaps in the wooden slats I could see points of light that pulsed in slow, hypnotic rhythms. Not the cold gleam of metal or glass, but something that radiated its own luminescence, something that dimmed and brightened with the rhythm of that persistent breathing sound. Phoenix appeared on the horizon just as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn. My cargo had grown increasingly restless during the final hours of the drive, and I could hear scratching sounds from within the crates, as if something was testing the strength of its wooden prison. The delivery address led me to another anonymous warehouse in an industrial district, where the same men in expensive suits were waiting with forklifts and concerned expressions. They unloaded the cargo quickly and efficiently, but I noticed they handled the crates with unusual care and kept their distance from the gaps in the canvas coverings. As the last crate disappeared into the warehouse, one of the men approached with my final payment. He was pale and sweating despite the cool morning air, and his hands trembled slightly as he counted out the bills. "You didn't look," he said, more statement than question. "You didn't try to see what was inside." When I assured him I hadn't, he seemed to relax slightly, but his eyes remained troubled. "That's good," he said. "That's very good. Some drivers, they get curious. Those drivers don't finish their routes." As I drove away from that warehouse in the growing daylight, I tried to convince myself that my imagination had run wild during a stressful night drive through difficult conditions. But even now, months later, I can't forget the feeling of those unseen eyes watching me through the darkness, or the certainty that whatever I'd carried across 3 states was ancient and patient and utterly alien. I still drive the same routes, still haul cargo for questionable clients when the money's right, but I never drive at night anymore, and I always check the manifest twice before I sign my name to anything. Because in this business, some freight is better left undelivered, and some questions are safer left unasked. The Laughing Highway, from Marcus Chen. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks through my CB radio. You know how it is out there on the long hauls, when you've been driving for 14 hours straight and your mind starts making patterns out of nothing. The laugh came right after I passed that jackknife semi on Interstate 40, somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, where the desert stretches endlessly under a sky so dark it swallows your headlights whole. It was a soft chuckle at first, like someone finding something mildly amusing, drifting through the static of my radio before fading into the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods for Midwest Express for the better part of 15 years, and in that time you see everything. Accidents happen out here more than people realize, especially on these remote stretches where cell service dies, and the nearest town is just a name on a faded highway sign. The semi I'd passed was wrapped around itself like a broken toy, its trailer torn open and spilling what looked like furniture across 3 lanes. Emergency vehicles hadn't arrived yet, just a state trooper with his flashers painting the asphalt in alternating red and blue. I slowed down like you're supposed to, gave the scene the respect it deserved, and kept moving. That's when I heard the laugh. The sound bothered me more than it should have. Maybe it was because I was running behind schedule, or maybe it was the way the moonlight seemed to make the desert landscape look like the surface of some dead planet, all shadow and silver. I cranked up my CB to channel 19, hoping to catch some chatter from other drivers, anything to break the silence that had settled over my cab like dust. But all I got was static, punctuated every few minutes by that same soft laughter, always coming right after another driver would report an accident or a breakdown somewhere along the route. By the time I reached the Flying J truck stop in Gallup, the laugh had become more distinct, more human. It didn't sound like radio interference anymore. It sounded like someone sitting right there in my passenger seat, finding genuine amusement in the misfortunes scattered along the highway. I parked beneath the pale fluorescent lights of the fuel island and stepped out into the cool desert air, stretching muscles that had been cramped behind the wheel for too long. The silence outside my cab was almost startling after hours of engine noise and that persistent, inexplicable laughter. Inside the truck stop, I grabbed coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration and struck up a conversation with a driver named Pete who was hauling electronics to Phoenix. He was an older guy, the kind who'd been working these routes since before GPS made navigation foolproof, and he had that weathered look that comes from decades of watching America roll by through a windshield. When I mentioned the strange sounds on my CB, his expression changed subtly, like clouds passing over the sun. Pete told me about something drivers had been whispering about for months, a phenomenon that no one wanted to discuss too openly because it sounded crazy. Accidents along certain stretches of highway were being followed by reports of laughter coming through CB radios, always at the same frequency, always with that same tone of quiet amusement. Some drivers claimed they'd heard it coming from the wrecked vehicles themselves, as if the trucks were somehow enjoying their own destruction. Others swore the laughter was getting stronger, more frequent, like whatever was causing it was gaining confidence or power. I wanted to dismiss it as highway folklore, the kind of stories that grow in the telling until they take on a life of their own. But as I climbed back into my cab and fired up the engine, tuning my CB to channel 19, I heard it again almost immediately. This time it was accompanied by a crackling transmission from a driver eastbound on I-40, reporting a multi-vehicle accident near the Arizona-New Mexico border. The laugh came right after he finished speaking, clear and unmistakable, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the truck stop coffee. The miles rolled by under my headlights as I continued east, and with each passing hour the laughter became more frequent. It seemed to coincide perfectly with every accident report, every breakdown, every moment when metal and physics conspired to bring disaster to the highway. But worse than that, I began to notice that the accidents themselves were increasing in frequency. Every 20 or 30 miles I'd pass another scene of twisted metal and emergency lights, each one fresh enough that the wreckage was still smoking. Near Tucumcari, I came upon an accident that couldn't have happened more than minutes before I arrived. A livestock hauler had somehow flipped completely over, and the trailer had split open like a can of sardines. I could see the driver in his cab hanging upside down in his safety harness, conscious but trapped. No emergency vehicles had arrived yet, and I was pulling over to help when my CB crackled to life with that familiar sound. But this time the laughter wasn't coming from my radio. It was coming from outside, echoing across the empty highway like it was being broadcast from speakers hidden in the desert itself. I grabbed my emergency kit and ran toward the overturned truck. But as I got closer, I realized the laughter was actually emanating from the wreckage. The truck's horn was stuck, but instead of producing the normal blast of an air horn, it was generating that horrible, amused chuckling sound. The driver was staring at his dashboard in confusion and terror, his eyes wide in the glow of his interior lights. When he saw me approaching, he started shouting something I couldn't quite make out over the sound of that demonic horn. As I worked to help free him from his harness, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone hanging upside down. His words came out in a rush, desperate and frightened. He told me his horn had been making strange noises for the past week, ever since he'd had some electrical work done at a shop in Riverside. It had started as just occasional hiccups in the normal horn sound, but gradually it had begun producing longer, more complex sounds. This afternoon, as he was driving through a construction zone, the horn had started laughing, and every time it laughed, he'd seen an accident happen somewhere ahead of or behind him on the highway. The emergency crews arrived just as we got him out of the cab, and I stayed long enough to give my statement to the state trooper. But as I walked back to my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The overturned semi's horn was still producing that laughter, even though the engine was off and the electrical system should have been dead. The sound was actually getting louder, more gleeful, as if it was feeding on the chaos and confusion surrounding the accident scene. I climbed back into my Peterbilt and tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and that laughing truck. But the sound seemed to follow me. Every few minutes, my CB would crackle with reports of new accidents, and each report was followed by that same horrible laughter. But now I was beginning to hear something else mixed in with the laughter, a sound like mechanical breathing. Like the highway itself was somehow alive and finding immense pleasure in the destruction taking place across its surface. Somewhere outside of Amarillo, as dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I pulled off at a truck stop and had my CB radio completely disconnected. The mechanic on duty looked at me like I was crazy, disconnecting the one piece of equipment that connected me to other drivers on the road. But I didn't care. The silence in my cab was like a blessing after hours of that terrible laughter. But even without the CB, I couldn't escape what was happening on the highway. Every few miles brought another accident scene, another collection of emergency vehicles and twisted metal. And as I drove past each one, I could hear that laughter drifting through my closed windows, carried on the wind like pollen. It was getting stronger, more confident, and I began to understand that whatever was causing this was spreading, moving from truck to truck like some kind of mechanical virus. I finished that run to Dallas in record time, pushing my rig harder than I should have, desperate to get off the interstate and away from whatever was turning the highway into a playground for some malevolent intelligence. When I finally backed up to the loading dock and shut down my engine, the silence was so profound it made my ears ring. But even in that quiet warehouse, surrounded by concrete walls and fluorescent lighting, I could swear I heard something mechanical chuckling softly in the distance. That was 3 months ago, and I haven't taken a long haul since. I've been working local routes, staying off the interstates, but the reports keep coming in through industry channels. Drivers are talking about trucks whose horns laugh after accidents, about a growing network of corrupted vehicles that seem to be actively causing the chaos they celebrate. Some say it started at a repair shop somewhere in California, that someone installed something they shouldn't have. The Eye That Never Sleeps, from Marcus Chen. The rear camera on my Kenworth T680 had been acting strange for 3 weeks now, and I should have listened to my gut when it first started showing me things that weren't there. The digital display mounted just above my CB radio flickered with static sometimes, revealing shadowy figures walking behind my trailer when my mirrors showed nothing but empty highway. I chalked it up to the camera getting old, maybe moisture seeping into the housing. But deep down I knew electronics don't create phantoms out of thin air. I was hauling refrigerated goods from Portland to Denver, taking my usual route through the Oregon highlands where the trees grow so thick they block out the moon. The October air had that crisp bite that made your breath visible, and my diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm as I climbed the winding mountain roads. Rain had been falling steadily since I left the distribution center, creating a hypnotic patter against my windshield that usually helped me stay focused during these long night drives. The camera display showed the normal view of my trailer's rear doors and the wet asphalt stretching behind me, illuminated by my red taillights. Everything looked ordinary until I noticed the figure walking about 50 feet back, matching my speed exactly. At first glance, it appeared to be a person in dark clothing, but when I checked my side mirrors, the road behind me was completely empty. I reduced my speed from 60 to 40, then to 30, but the figure maintained its perfect distance, never getting closer or falling behind. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a software glitch, or perhaps the camera was picking up some kind of reflection from my taillights bouncing off the wet pavement. I reached over and tapped the display screen with my finger, hoping to clear whatever was causing the false image. But the figure remained there, walking with an unnatural smoothness that made my skin crawl. The highway stretched ahead for miles without any turnoffs, just endless curves cutting through dense forest on both sides. I couldn't pull over safely, and something told me I didn't want to stop anyway, not with that thing following behind me. The rain intensified, turning from a gentle patter to a heavy drumming that made it harder to see the road ahead. But the rear camera view remained crystal clear, showing every detail of the dark figure that shouldn't exist. I tried radio channels, hoping to reach another trucker who might be able to look back and tell me what they saw. But static filled every frequency. The isolation pressed in around me like a physical weight, making the cab feel smaller and the darkness outside more complete. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway, needing something familiar to ground myself as the impossible figure continued its relentless pursuit. The camera began showing more details that made no sense. The figure cast no shadow despite being illuminated by my tail lights, and its movement had a flowing quality like it was gliding rather than walking. Sometimes it appeared closer, maybe 30 feet back, and I could make out what looked like a face turned upward, but the features were indistinct, blurred like a watercolor painting left in the rain. Miles passed in this strange procession, me driving steadily through the mountain curves while my electronic stalker maintained its vigil behind me. I started talking to myself, narrating what I saw to keep my mind sharp and focused, but my voice sounded thin and strange in the enclosed cab. The engine's hum seemed different too, carrying an underlying vibration that I felt in my chest. like a second heartbeat keeping time with the figure's impossible stride. When I finally reached a truck stop near the Idaho border, I pulled in carefully, watching the rear camera display to see what would happen when I stopped. The figure halted immediately, standing motionless in the middle of the empty road behind my trailer. I climbed out into the cold rain, ignoring how it soaked through my jacket in seconds, and walked around to the back of my rig to see for myself. Nothing was there. The road stretched empty in both directions under the truck stop's fluorescent lights, just wet asphalt reflecting yellow and white. But when I looked at the camera display on my phone using the wireless connection, the figure stood exactly where the screen showed it, patient and still, waiting for something I couldn't understand. Inside the truck stop, I bought more coffee and tried to shake off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. Other drivers sat at scattered tables talking quietly about weather conditions and load schedules, normal conversations that felt surreal after what I'd been experiencing. I wanted to ask if anyone else had camera problems, but how could I explain seeing a figure that didn't exist following my truck through the mountains? The mechanic on duty looked at my camera system and shrugged, saying everything appeared to be functioning normally. The connections were tight, the lens was clean, and the software was up to date. He suggested I might have seen reflections or maybe headlight glare from a car that turned off before I could spot it in my mirrors. But his explanations felt hollow and insufficient. Back on the road, the figure resumed its position immediately, as if it had been waiting patiently for my return. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds still blocked most of the starlight, leaving only my headlights to carve a path through the darkness ahead. I tried covering the camera display with a piece of paper, but knowing the thing was still there made the concealment feel useless, like hiding from a predator by closing your eyes. As I descended toward the valley floor, something changed. The figure began moving closer, not gradually but in sudden jumps that defied physics. One moment it was 50 feet back, the next it was 30, then 20 without any transition between positions. My speedometer showed I was maintaining steady speed, but somehow the impossible thing was gaining ground, and I could see more details that I desperately wished would remain hidden. Its face, when I caught glimpses of it in the shifting camera angle, was completely wrong. The features were human-shaped, but arranged in ways that hurt to look at directly. Like my brain couldn't process the visual information properly. Sometimes it appeared to have too many eyes. Other times, none at all. Just smooth skin where a face should be, but always with that upward tilt as if it was watching me through the camera itself. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. The figure wasn't following my truck at all. It was watching me specifically, using the rear camera as a window to peer into my world from somewhere else entirely. Every time I looked at the display, I was making contact with something that existed in the electronic space between reality and the digital representation of it. The camera wasn't malfunctioning. It was working perfectly, showing me exactly what was there in that liminal space where technology touches the unknown. I tried shutting off the camera system entirely, but the display remained active, drawing power from some source I couldn't identify. The figure moved closer still, now just 10 feet behind my trailer, and I could see it reaching forward with arms that were too long and fingers that stretched like shadows. The cab filled with a low humming sound that didn't come from my engine, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the camera display itself. Denver's lights appeared ahead like a constellation fallen to Earth, promising safety in numbers and the comfort of human civilization. But as I approached the city limits, I realized the figure was no longer following behind me. It was somehow ahead of me now, waiting at the delivery dock where I would have to stop, where I would have to turn off my engine and step out into the darkness where cameras couldn't protect me from whatever lived in their electronic dreams. The last thing I saw before I shut my eyes and drove blind toward the loading dock was the figure's impossible face filling the entire camera display, pressing forward as if it could break through the screen itself. And in that moment I understood that some things are better left unwatched, because when you stare too long into the digital abyss, Something far worse than your reflection starts staring back.